Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, Rodney Van Vuren slammed the ball of clay angrily onto the potter's wheel. He began furiously working with his hands, throwing his sponge of water over the round wedge of clay, using his steady, skilled, nimble fingers to manipulate the shapeless blob, which impressively began to yield under the firm caresses of his persuasive fingers, so it finally took on a pleasing bow-like shape. Rodney effortlessly made everything he produced on the potter's wheel look like a piece of cake, as he skillfully began to create another one of his incredible masterpieces that would probably sell for a sizable amount of money. He even gave pottery lessons 2 evenings a week and every Saturday morning, and most people marvelled at his magical touch, for he had become a proficient master of his craft, who made everything look easy, when the reality could not be further from the truth. Ostensibly his work was always in high demand, and he had a plethora of orders still on hold, and for one so young, he was making a great name for himself in the world of art. Rodney had been doing pottery since he was 13 years old, but once he became 23, his work had just blossomed. People were naturally drawn to his huge glazed pots. Some pieces could be as large as 4 foot high and 4 foot across, all glazed masterfully in resplendent blues, browns and green hues. And his incredible ability to work with glazes had gleaned for him many ardent admirers, as his signature colours were uniquely individualistic. Rodney was ever thankful to have a job he loved, where he worked comfortably from home, according to his own unique schedule. He was a free-spirited man, who would never have done well working under somebody else's instruction. Rodney's pottery studio was built about 300 feet away from his colonial farmhouse, on the edge of the wood grove of tall, lofty trees. It was here where he was left to his own devices, so his beloved studio had literally become his home from home and his quintessential favourite playground, the place he would ultimately escape to get away from his annoying wife Lisa. If Rodney had any regrets in his life, it was marrying that spoilt, tiresome woman, with a tongue on her as sharp as a razor blade, and with an air of such entitlement that was something he'd never been able to come to terms with. He realized his wife was a product of an affluent lifestyle, where no was not a word ever engaged in the Papadopoulos household, from where she'd grown up, and her adoring father had refused her absolutely nothing. If Rodney dared to say no to his wife Lisa, his life was frankly not worth living. So he'd found himself giving in to her every fanciful whim. It was so much easier that way, just to keep the peace. She was the kind of woman who would make a scene and have a tantrum if you didn't agree to her every request. There was no middle ground with her, no room for negotiation or frank discussion. How he regretted marrying Lisa, with all of his heart, but he had to be seen to be doing the right thing at the time, especially with Lisa's intimidating father, breathing fire down his neck like a dragon. It was 8 long years ago since he'd married Lisa, and it may as well have been a lifetime, for it certainly felt like that. The years had dragged by so slowly, like an old lady taking all day to cross to the other side of the road. Why did he feel like this? Because, put simply, he couldn't stand his wife Lisa. He loathed her. He wondered if there were other men like himself, unwillingly trapped in a loveless marriage. He certainly hoped he was not alone. Did other men own up to their unhappiness, he wondered? Or did they clandestinely bury it away, like a squirrel hides their acorns away from prying eyes? Did they bravely try to get on with their lives as best as they could, stoically wearing a smile on their faces, like the colourful tie they put on every morning before work? The idea that others might be suffering like he was, plodding along dutifully in their disabled marriages, brought him a small measure of comfort. Ostensibly, there was some truth in the age-old adage that misery loves company. He had been 20 at the time, when he tied the knot with Lisa. How callow, naive, ignorant of the world's duplicitous and guileful ways he had been, and how he wished he had stood up for himself at the time. But regret was not something he could afford to entertain. It would only pepper his life with more frustrated chaos, and there was no point in dwelling on a situation he could not easily change, without ruffling feathers and causing a great deal of unrest. The last person in the world he wanted to upset was Mr. Papadopoulos, for that man was made out of his darkest nightmares. He would never forget the day that was to change his life forever. It all began when the defiant 19-year-old Lisa Papadopoulos came thundering to his parents' front door, her hazel brown eyes blazing furiously. The indignant woman had knocked on the door as if she was a mad housewife whacking dough furiously hard with a rolling pin in order to make it more malleable. "I need to speak to your son right now," she demanded, when Rodney's mother Josie had opened the door to what she could only describe as an irate young woman, wearing the expression of a black thundercloud on her face. "What is this about, young lady?" Mrs. Van Vuren had asked. "My name is Lisa Papadopoulos," the young woman had corrected her haughtily. "If you don't mind, this is between me and your son," she had said caustically. "I need to speak to him at once, this minute." Mrs. Van Vuren didn't like the brusque, clipped tone of this young, presumptuous young lady, who had barged into her front door like a wild horse eager to tear down its stable. She was not used to a young woman speaking to her so curtly, as if she was the household skivvy, rather than Rodney's own mother. She told herself the girl seemed upset about something. She should make allowances for her. Then suddenly she thought she knew what this was about, and a nauseous taste impregnated the back of her throat. "Please God, no," she thought. "Don't let my son have made this girl pregnant. Dear God, please not her. Anyone else but her." Mrs. Van Vuren had decided when she'd laid eyes on Lisa Papadopoulos that she didn't like this self-important, stuck-up, disagreeable, very arrogant young lady. Even a little bit. The woman was so sour she could easily curdle cream, not to mention people's stomachs. "Very well," she said. "I'll call him. You make yourself comfortable in the kitchen. It's the room there on the left. Just go there and sit over on one of those bar chairs around the marble island." When Rodney was told by his mother that a toffee-nosed young lady was there to see him, and appeared to be capriciously belligerent, Rodney began to wonder who his visitor could be. But based on his mother's description, Miss High and Mighty could only fit Lisa Papadopoulos's profile. When he observed the overbearing, familiar young lady sitting there defiantly on the bar stool in his kitchen, swinging her legs against the lower panels of the island, his heart dropped like a heavy stone, sinking to the bottom of a large lake. What the hell did she want? He hoped he'd never see that girl again. What was she doing at his parents' house? She had a real nerve coming here, he thought. Lisa Papadopoulos had been all over him at that party he had attended a couple of months ago. and this persuasive, manipulative young lady had practically thrown herself shamelessly at him, like wet toilet roll being flung across a classroom. He'd never liked Lisa Papadopoulos. No one really did. Why he had allowed himself to be swept away by her, like a hat blown away by the wind, God only knows. One thing had led to another, and after one night of awkward, rather embarrassing fumbling between the two of them, he hoped he'd never see the likes of her again. He'd been deliberately avoiding her ever since on the university campus, but now there she was, like a very bad odorous smell, sitting there presumptuously in the kitchen, like a puffed-up, conceited penguin that thought the world about herself. And to make matters far worse, she seemed too comfortable in her own boots for his liking. She had made herself at home on the bar stool, continuing to swing her long legs annoyingly against the gleaming white-polished wooden panels of his mother's beloved island. "What do you want, Lisa?" he asked her gingerly. "I told you I'm sorry about what happened at the party 2 months back. I really am. I think you know we both got carried away. But as I told you last Wednesday, when you kept bugging me on campus, I'm not interested in a relationship with you. I've been telling you that for ages, Lisa, but you don't seem to know the meaning of the word no. I thought I made my position clear to you. I need to focus on my fine arts degree. I've not got time to get caught up in all kinds of relationship issues. I just want to be footloose and fancy-free at this stage of my life. I would appreciate it if you left me alone, Lisa. And as for coming to my parents' house like this, it's an incredible cheek. If you wanted to speak to me in person, why didn't you text me or ask me to meet you for a coffee somewhere?" "That's easy, Rodney. You wouldn't have answered my texts, would you? And as for meeting me for coffee, that would never ever happen, would it? You used me that night 2 months ago, and no one should kick me to the curb like this. Is that how it works with you? No one treats me like this, Rodney, and gets away with it. I know you've been deliberately avoiding me, and that's really heartless and cruel. I thought what we had between the two of us was special." "If I remember correctly, it was you propositioning me, not the other way round, Lisa," said Rodney. "I am bloody pregnant, and what are you going to do about it?" she said with a smug, triumphant look on her face, as if she had him now by the short and curlies, and he could not do a damn thing about it. "You're what?" asked Rodney, his face going white. "You heard. Do I need to spell it out to you?" "Well, what are you going to do about it?" asked Rodney obsequiously. "What am I going to do about it? Are you joking?" said Lisa insolently, rolling her brown eyes in the back of her head. "That's rich coming from you, Rodney. Oh, it's typical, isn't it? You don't want to take responsibility for what you've done to me." "Well, what exactly do you want me to do about it, Lisa? You're the one that's pregnant. The choice is in your hands. It's your body, not mine. I doubt I have any say in the matter anyway. But whatever your decision, I'm willing to support you all the way, whether it be financial or emotional. I can't say fairer than that." "I'm keeping the baby, and I think in the circumstances we should get married, don't you, Rodney?" "Lisa, for goodness sake, be realistic. You're 19. I'm only a couple of months older than you are. We're both very young. People at our age don't get married. As I was saying, I will support you with a baby. Of course I will. But I don't even know you. Well, not really. I've seen you around campus from time to time. We had one fling. That was it. But it was instigated by you, I might add. I was the one that was trying to walk away. But you literally pinned me down like a dog on a chain. I thought we'd been careful, but I'm sure you appreciate. I can't be tied down at such a young age. It would be folly for us to get married. We have nothing in common, and I don't even love you. And that might be a start for an enduring relationship, surely." "I knew you would do this. It's so typical, said Lisa fractiously, picking up an empty bottle of white wine on the kitchen counter and flinging it at the opposite wall, so that it smashed into hundreds of glass shards. You're such a loser, Rodney. So predictable. So incredibly predictable. I might have known you'd react like this. You're textbook. You're no different to those other boys at campus, using and abusing women and spitting them out all the time. It makes me sick. I hate you. Did you hear that, Rodney? I bloody hate you. You should do the right thing by me and ask me to be your wife. But look at you. You're no gentleman. You're a loser. And thanks to you, my baby will grow up without a father, because you haven't got the guts to be a chivalrous gentleman or to do the right thing by me. In the olden days, your behaviour would have been described as scandalous. Mrs. Van Vuren came hurriedly dashing into the kitchen after hearing the dreadful sound of glass shattering and Lisa's high-pitched wailing. What on earth is all this noise about? She cried out in horror, staring nonplussed at the smashed glass on the floor. Some pieces looked treacherously sharp and jagged. Mrs. Van Vuren was relieved that no one had been hurt. She looked at Lisa disapprovingly. Did you just throw that empty bottle of wine at the wall? She asked the young lady, her voice unable to disguise her abject disgust. So what if I did? Said Lisa with a condescending smirk. I am sorry, Lisa, if that's what you call yourself, but I didn't invite you in my house to go smashing glass at will. This is not how we behave in the Van Vuren household. You're far too old to be behaving like a 2-year-old brat. Have you any comprehension how dangerous it is to throw wine bottles around the place? Did it not even occur to you that a glass shard could get caught in someone's eye or lodged itself into someone's chest? I used to be a nurse, Lisa, at the local hospital, and in accident and emergency I would see dreadful accidents because of people like yourself throwing stuff like this around. One woman killed her husband that way when a glass shard plunged into his heart. She was devastated about what had happened, but she should have known better than throwing a glass vase around. And you should have known better as well, Lisa. Oh, get over yourself, said Lisa. And keep your butt out of our business, Mrs. Van Vuren. You're the one that's overreacting here, not me, said Lisa, bulldozing contemptuously past Mrs. Van Vuren in the kitchen, where she thundered into the hall, finally exiting the house through the front door, banging it loudly behind her with a mighty slam. They could hear her swanky white Mercedes accelerating down their drive as she sped off and was gone faster than a flash of lightning. And only when they were sure she had finally left the property did Rodney and his mother breathe a sigh of relief. What on earth is her problem, Rodney? Asked Mrs. Van Vuren, looking at her son in horror. That young lady has got an unbridled temper on her. If she's got a gripe with you, why does she not talk about it to you in a civilized manner, like a normal, well-rounded human being? Instead, she waltzes into our house as if she owns the place, like an elephant in a china shop, and throws a wobbly in our kitchen. Mrs. Van Vuren pats her forehead with a towel, as the unpleasant incident had made her break out into a sizable sweat. Her heart was flapping in her chest from the aftershock of such a tumultuous scare. Oh dear, I've seen some unruly, insubordinate behaviour in my lifetime, but that girl takes the biscuit. Why on earth did she do that with the wine bottle? Has she lost leave of her senses, Rodney? It's the first time I've met her, and I sincerely hope it will be the last. She behaves like that, Mum, because she comes from an affluent family, I'm told. It's new money, I believe, who have not tamed her cocky insolence, but have actually probably encouraged her to be so overbearing. I've been told by those who know her that she's a daddy's girl. He gives her everything she could possibly want. She's got that pretentious bumptiousness and contemptuous pride that comes about from someone who's never had to work for anything a day in their life. I just wish, Mum, I'd never had the misfortune to cross her path in campus. Unfortunately, she's doing a fine arts degree, but she's not talented at all. I have no comprehension why she's actually doing it. I had a fling with her 2 months back, and she's been bugging me ever since, demanding that we go steady. I told her I was not in the least bit interested. I think because I keep fobbing her off. She keeps coming back to me like a desperate puppy dog. It's pathetic. The more I reject her, the more irresistible I seem to become to her. There is no other word for her, but she's a precocious little brat, said Mrs. Van Vuren, wiping her hands on her apron, as if wiping away the unfortunate woman she'd just met. I hope I never see that lady again. Her kind in my life I can well do without. Her parents should be ashamed of themselves. I do not care if they've got enough gold to sink the Titanic, or enough cash to drown the Bank of America. If those parents had said no to that cocky-handed high horse just a few times in her life, she might not have turned out to be so obnoxiously objectionable. I've never had a young lady address me in the way she did just now. I'm appalled. Mum, brace yourself for some bad news. I don't know how to tell you this, but she's pregnant with my baby. She's intending to keep it. That's what all the commotion was about. I didn't react in the way she hoped I would. She had a hissy fit, threw a wine bottle at the wall. She was a hell of a scary when she got angry, as you yourself saw. Oh, my God, son! For once in my life I'm lost for words. What have you done? Said Mrs. Van Vuren, placing a startled hand over her mouth. And with her, of all people! Anybody else but her! Don't you know the cardinal rules in life, son? Did me and your father never teach you anything? Never ever get intimate with someone you would not be prepared to spend the rest of your life with. It could come back to bite you, and it clearly has. That young lady is toxically poisonous. You know how old-fashioned your father can be. He'll put the pressure on you to get married to her. He won't want any grandchild of his to be raised without a solid foundation. And even if you don't marry her, that woman will remain in our lives whether we like it or not, because she's carrying your child in her womb, which is also our grandchild. That's what she wants, Mum. She wants me to marry her. She made that very clear to me. Who wants to marry who? Asked Mr. Van Vuren, entering the kitchen at the most inopportune time. Mr. Van Vuren was a 6-foot teddy bear, with the heart of a lion, but he had very staunch views when it came to matters concerning family. Children at all times needed to be raised by 2 adults, in his humble opinion. He was an esteemed psychologist who worked with dysfunctional children every single day of his life, kids badly damaged from broken homes. Mr. Van Vuren had returned home from work, and Rodney and his mother had not heard his approach. He threw a copy of the newspaper onto the kitchen counter, marching over to the refrigerator to remove a large jug of homemade lemonade from the glass shelf. The ice in the jug tinkled as he poured some lemonade into a very large tumbler, and then he drank it back in one long gulp, while Mrs. Van Vuren and her son gave each other awkward, somewhat dismayed glances. They knew they'd have to let the cat out of the bag sooner or later, and neither of them were sure how Mr. Van Vuren would ultimately react to the news. By all accounts, learning his son had fathered a child at 19 years old would likely go down with him like a lead balloon. Ah, that is so much better. It's quite hot out there today. The air conditioner at the office is on the blink, would you believe it? The suppliers are only going to fix it in the morning. In some of my therapy sessions today, my clients were sweating buckets. It was quite dreadful. I thought I was going to die in those offices. It was unbearable. I was quite parched, but no matter how much water I drank, I don't seem to be hydrated. He glanced from his wife to his son. Now, what's going on here? Why do I feel that there's an elephant in the room that you don't want to talk about? Especially to me. I noticed how silent you became when I intruded on your conversation. So I'm assuming it's something you don't want to tell me, which concerns me greatly. So are you going to tell me what's going on? Or am I going to have to squeeze you for the information, like a tube of toothpaste very hard, or like one of my clients that refuses to talk? I'm very good at getting the truth out. I do it every day of my life. Sweetheart, in this case you do well not to ask any questions, because you're absolutely right. Your flapping ears would be best served if you didn't listen to this, said Mrs. Van Vuren, wrapping her arms around her husband in an affectionate hug. You are right. There is an elephant in the room that we don't really want to talk about, I'm afraid. You're on to the money about that. I'm afraid Rodney here, well, he's got himself into a spot of trouble. What kind of trouble, son, have you got yourself embroiled in? He asked with concerned grey eyes. What have you done? There is no easy way to say this, honey, but Rodney, well, he's made a young girl on campus pregnant, I'm afraid. She's going to have the baby. She's very insistent about that, I believe. Her name is Lisa Papadopoulos. When you say Papadopoulos, are you talking about Freddie Papadopoulos's daughter? Yes, I think that's her father's name, said Rodney. Oh, I've heard rumours about that dreadful man. Not good ones, I'm afraid. Oh, my word, son, what have you done? The man's involved in organised crime, but he's never been caught. Far too clever for that. Not the kind of family I want any son of mine involved with. But I am glad she's having the baby. That's the right thing to do in the circumstances. No one is going to abort a grandchild of mine. But, son, you are far too young to become a father at 19 years old. What have you done? Why did you let this happen? I thought you'd be so much more responsible than this. I don't know what to do, Dad. I've really messed up, said Rodney. How do you know he's involved in organised crime, Dad? I don't know if he is. That's the rumours that are going around. But sometimes rumours have a glimmer of the truth, don't they? I don't know what to do, Dad. I really messed up, said Rodney. I mean, I've got my fine arts degree, and now this. I never expected this to happen. Too right you messed up, son. And as for expecting this to happen, well, not expecting this to happen, I mean, you are incredibly naive. If you put your hand in the fire, you're invariably going to get burnt. But the problem is people make the same old mistake over and over again. I find this all the time in my practice. They always believe it's going to happen to someone else, never ever to them. You know what you need to do now. The chivalrous thing is to marry her in the circumstances, even if the poor girl has the misfortune to be Freddie Papadopoulos's daughter. But I mean, beggars can't be choosers. It's the right thing to do, isn't it? But, Dad, I'm far too young to get married. And these days people have children out of wedlock all the time. They don't necessarily get married, do they? This is why, son, there are so many dysfunctional kids out there that develop all kinds of issues, as they have not had two parents watching over their charge. I see it all the time in my work. The devastation of broken families. I don't want to see that happen to our grandchild. You may be too young to get married, son, but your baby is too young to grow up without a father. And if you don't get married, then you will be a distant father. You won't have a hands-on relationship with your child. You do realize that children that grow up without parental role models can end up with all kinds of issues. Some children will feel abandoned and unloved. Do you want to do that to your own son or your own daughter? No, of course not, Dad. In theory, what you say makes sense. But it's not very practical, because you see I don't love Lisa, and if the truth be told, I don't like her either. How can I possibly marry someone that I actually loathe? Well, son, as I've told you since you were old enough to understand, you never, and I mean never, get intimate with someone you don't love. Only a fool does that. You could end up saddled with their baby. You are now in a precarious position where you have to take responsibility for the baby's sake, because this is your child we're talking about. This is not about you anymore. There is a young, vulnerable life to consider. You're going to have to be very unselfish about this matter. Do the right thing by your baby. I can't tell you what to do, son, but I strongly advise you to marry this young woman who you have got pregnant. There are a lot of people out there who would strongly disagree with my suggestion. But it is unfortunate that you don't like her. But you have made your bed. You're going to have to lie on it and make the best of a bleak situation. This is your responsibility, son.
We're not living in the 1950s, sweetheart, said Josie Van Vuren. Our son can do the right thing for the baby without having to marry that disagreeable girl. Surely. You have no idea what she's like, Hugo. Why, I don't believe I've ever met such a condescending little brat.
Look, sweetheart, many people around the world marry people they don't even know. It's called an arranged marriage. Believe it or not, the success rate of those relationships is 1,000 times better than marriages you see here in America. People think a relationship is all about passion. Absolutely not. Marriages all require hard work in order to make them succeed. It's like anything in life. What you put into it is what you will get back out of it. I'm sure our son can make it work with this young lady, if he puts his mind to it. And you never know, in time he may grow to love her. After all, she is the mother of his child.
But you don't know what she's like, Hugo. It's not that simple. I promise you it's not. You haven't met her. She came barging into our house today, demanding to speak to Rodney. She is one of the most appalling young women I have ever had the privilege to meet. And it's all because she's been raised so badly.
You've only met her briefly, sweetheart, and far too quickly to form an opinion. Of course she's upset she's pregnant. Wouldn't you be? You might not have seen her at her very best. I'm not exactly the nicest person when I'm in a cantankerous mood. Give the girl a break, will you? Maybe she's not as bad as she sounds. And if she's had her eye on Rodney, well, I'll give her this. She's got excellent taste in young men, and that's a promising start. I think you need to go and see the young lady, Rodney. Test the water for yourself. See where you want to go to from here, going forward, I mean. Me and your mother will support you every step of the way. Any decision you make, you've got our back. You know my feelings on the matter. I personally could not imagine what it would have been like if I had abandoned you when you were young, leaving Josie to take care of you by herself. The thought is too preposterous to even entertain.
Well, I do admit, I wouldn't have coped terribly well, being a single mother, admitted Josie. Even if you had been financially helping me, Hugo. It's tough being a parent, especially a single one. They never tell you that in the small print, do they? Society makes it all out to be so cute. But what about the dirty nappies, the sleepless nights? They never tell you all about that. I think I should write a book. I'll call it The Darker Side of Becoming a Full-Time Parent. Rodney had decided that the best thing he could possibly do was to visit Lisa. His father was absolutely right. One way or another, having a baby to care for so young was going to ultimately wreak havoc on his entire life, turning everything upside down and higgledy-piggledy. Things had certainly ended badly that day when Lisa fortuitously visited their property. But what did she expect when she pulled that trick out of the bag like this, and seemed to expect Rodney to jump up and down for joy like an ebullient puppy dog. It was hard to even conceive of becoming a father. It was something he was looking forward to way ahead in the future, but certainly not now, not when he was 19 years old, for goodness sake. When Rodney arrived at the Papadopoulos' ostentatious Charleston home, he was somewhat taken aback. The lofty, somewhat pompous Italianate architecture was pretentiously over the top. The swanky house boasted a large white wall that fringed the outer boundaries of the entire property, where several large statues that looked like they emulated the statue of the David in Italy were on full display, screaming a perverse vulgarity. They were all about 15 foot tall, very well endowed figurines, set about 3 feet apart. One statue might have been all right, but dozens of these replicas, in front of the outside boundary wall, just reeked of new money, little style, and certainly no savoir-faire. The ostentatious black wrought iron gates opened for him when he spoke through the security intercom to announce his arrival. "Hello, I'm here to see Lisa, please. It is Rodney here, Rodney Van Vuren." He got the strange impression his visit was expected. Rodney drove his very ordinary car down the lavish driveway to the front of the gingerbread-like house. His stomach squirmed in disgust. The whole place was just so in your face, as if the over-embellished gilded house itself was saying to him pompously, "Hey, look at me. I'm so fabulously resplendent and florid. What is someone like you doing here?" Rodney felt out of his depth as he reluctantly walked up the sandstone steps towards the ostentatious, gleaming black front door, to be greeted by a beaming Lisa. How different her demeanour was now. She spoke to him in a cloying, syrupy, sweet voice. "Oh, Rodney, I'm so glad you've come. I was expecting you. It's brilliant to see you." Rodney was taken aback by this. Why would Lisa be expecting him, after the drama that had ensued at his house, when Lisa had thrown the empty bottle of wine at the wall of the kitchen? Was she a great manipulator who knew how to get exactly what she wanted from everyone? One little tantrum and they'd come running, like he'd done tonight. Lisa's mother came hurrying up towards Rodney, throwing her golden brown arms around him effusively, as if he was the prodigal son who had returned home after a long sabbatical. "It is so good to see you, Rodney. So good. Lisa's told me all about you. I feel as if I've known you all my life. Let's have a look at you," she said, stepping backwards. "Oh, you're so right, Lisa. He looks just like the statue of the David," she giggled. "And I'm told that you look even better, Rodney, without your clothes on," she said, giving the young man a wink. Rodney blushed a bright red colour. He couldn't believe that Mrs. Papadopoulos was being so inappropriate. "You have such an innocent, angelic face, dear, and the bluest eyes that I would die to swim in. You've got the cutest dimples," she said, squeezing Rodney's cheeks on either side. "But I know that underneath the innocent bravado is quite the little tiger," she said, making a little growl. "Ah, I like my men to bite," she said with a giggle. "Oh, my God, I wish I was young again," she said. "I'm stuck with Lisa's father, and let's just say, well, he's let himself go a little, but don't you dare tell him I told you so. He'll be most affronted. Isn't Lisa so lucky to be able to stare at you all day long, like a Renaissance painting? Oh, how I envy her! But wait until I tell my friends about my daughter's new love. You better watch yourself, Rodney. Some of my friends aren't quite as tame as I am. They just might want to eat you. You're so sumptuous." "Oh, Mum, please stop embarrassing me." Oh, goodness gracious, Lisa. Oh, stop being so overreactive. I'm quite sure that Rodney here has been propositioned many times before. Haven't you, Rodney, dear? She said, tweaking his cheeks. Not really, said Rodney politely. Oh, nonsense! I don't believe that for a single moment. You're being incredibly bashful. A young man as handsome as you. I don't buy that for a second. Rodney couldn't believe that Lisa's brash, flirtatious mother was so in your face, as much as the loud house she occupied, as well as her well-endowed statues that you were not allowed to forget, where nothing was left to the imagination. Modesty was clearly not a virtue embraced in the Papadopoulos household. He shouldn't have been surprised by this. Lisa's mother was like mutton dressed up as lamb. Did she not realize how ridiculously silly she looked? A 40-year-old woman, dressing like a teenager going to a disco. She was wearing a tight, very short leopard skin skirt and a black low-cut top, where her very expensive Dolly Parton-sized assets were shown off to their best advantage. There was nothing refined, subtle, or remotely understated by this very abrasive woman, who wanted to stand out like a splash of bright red colour on a David Hockney painting. She had long manicured nails and ash-blonde, very highlighted hair. But it was her crinkled, leathery skin that, from overexposure to the sun, gave her an unfortunate appearance of a wizened tortoise, and the rouge on her cheeks had been so overdone it looked like it had been applied by a child. How could anyone's skin look this leathery? Rodney secretly thought she had probably been sunning herself like a sun-dried tomato at too many luxury resorts on perfectly white sandy beaches all over the world, where she was waited on hand and foot like the Queen of Sheba. He could envisage her bathing in cow's milk like Cleopatra had done, for she would spare herself no extravagance. Quite frankly, she appeared to be as spoilt and self-entitled as Lisa did. It would seem the apple did not fall very far from the tree. "Oh, Rodney, darling, come this way," she said, beckoning for Rodney to follow her with one of her slimy green manicured fingers that looked as treacherously sharp as a cat's claws. "My husband would adore to speak to you now. He's simply dying to meet you. I can't wait to tell him you're here. Lisa has told him all about you, but she never mentioned you looked like the statue of the David. We wouldn't want him to get jealous, would we?" she said, giving Rodney a wink. "Word of warning, my husband is a wee bit intimidating, but he's a teddy bear, really, providing you behave yourself. Then he won't bite," she said, growling again coquettishly. "Ah, ah." Rodney found himself being ushered into a palatial office where the gilded leather chairs looked like thrones. The lavish office reeked of wealth and really lousy taste. There was a taxidermist tiger head on the wall that appeared to be leering at Rodney with its full mouth of sharp canine teeth. It was funny, he thought, how wealthy people loved to have lions or tiger heads on their walls. Was it a symbol of power and prestige, he wondered? Most likely, but Rodney knew he'd far rather see a tiger out in the natural world than trussed up arrogantly and egotistically on someone's wall like an illustrious hunting trophy. Maybe Mr. Papadopoulos would pretend he'd shot it himself, a tall, fictitious story he'd lightly boast about to his gullible, very impressionable friends to impress them. People with the glittering collage of new wealth enjoyed to flaunt it. Rodney squirmed with disgust at the very idea. There was nothing impressive about killing the king of the jungle in his book. Rodney glanced around the showy office that was busy with flashy detail and felt incredibly small and inconspicuous. Every part of him wanted to run for the hills as fast as he could, but he tried to remain grounded and tethered to the chair. What did Lisa's father want to talk to him about? Was he going to give him the riot act? Did he know that Rodney had made his daughter pregnant? The very thought made him quiver nervously, while his awkward feet tapped the floor in a self-soothing gesture. Lisa's father, Freddie, entered that office with a huge beam on his face, of perfectly white, expensive teeth that probably cost a fortune at the dentist.
Rodney thought that Lisa's father looked like a gangster, with his open white shirt and his large cocky gold chain around his thick neck. He stared at Rodney through his inquisitive dark brown eyes, extending his hand to shake it. His grip was hard, rather fierce and firm. Rodney noticed his very affluent gold rings on his fingers that were studded with what looked like red rubies, although he couldn't be sure. "It's very good to meet you finally, Rodney," he said, in a raspy voice that Rodney suspected meant the man smoked a tad too much. He noticed a box of Cuban cigars on the desk and an ashtray full of used studs. How many cigars did Freddie Papadopoulos smoke a day? The sideboard was cluttered with crystal decanters, filled with every kind of drink. There was an empty tumbler on the desk, and Mr. Papadopoulos smelt of whiskey on his breath, but he wasn't drunk. He was probably one of those men who could handle his booze rather well. Mr. Papadopoulos looked like the kind of man who could handle anything. He had that hard look on his face that gave Rodney the distinct impression that if you rubbed him up the wrong way, it could land you in a whole heap of trouble. "Lisa has told me all about you, Rodney. She can't stop talking about you. She seems quite smitten," he told me. "Now I understand you wish to marry her, and that you and my daughter are expecting your first baby. So congratulations are in order," he said, walking over to Rodney and giving him a hard slap on the back that made Rodney almost jump out of his skin. "I've always wanted a grandchild, Rodney, and he or she, I assure you, will want for nothing. When I learned that you were not of Greek heritage, I was disappointed, I won't deny that. But Lisa assures me you have a great talent with your hands, that you're quite an extraordinary potter and a very skilled artist. Very appreciative I am of people who have gifts like that, and I will spare no expense, Rodney, for you to get the best possible tuition to advance your craft to the highest level." Rodney wanted to tell Lisa's father that he had not planned to marry his daughter, but was willing to do everything he could to be a good father to his child. But he felt tongue-tied, as if he couldn't say a word. All he could say was, "Well, I'm very glad to see you taking responsibility, Rodney. Not many men your age would. And the answer is unequivocally yes. You may indeed have my daughter, my little princess's hand in marriage. I know you're rather bashful to ask me outright, but never you mind, you're still very young. But there is no need to feel so self-conscious. I am delighted to welcome you into the Papadopoulos family with open arms. My little princess tells me she knew you were the one for her the moment she laid her eyes on you. And what my daughter wants, my daughter always gets. I can't help myself as far as my little princess is concerned. She is my entire world. I must give you one word of warning, Rodney. If you hurt my little princess, you will have me to deal with." He lowered his voice to a threatening pitch. "Anyone who hurts my princess is as good as dead, and I mean that literally." He then roared with laughter, "Ha, ha, ha," as if he'd made a huge joke. But Rodney knew that Mr. Papadopoulos was not joking. "Oh, I couldn't help overhearing," said Mrs. Papadopoulos, bursting into the room, holding her daughter's hands. "Did you hear that, Lisa? You're going to get married. Isn't this exciting? Oh, I just can't wait. Oh, and my daughter is marrying such a charming young man. Now the next thing to concern myself with is what I am going to wear for the wedding. I definitely need to stand out so that everybody can admire my outfit. It's very important that I make an impression." Ostensibly, everything had gone like a whirlwind. The power had been removed from Rodney's hands. He'd found himself immersed in the heart of it all, swept away like a helpless dandelion seed on the wind, without being able to navigate himself to a safe mooring place. He couldn't do a damn thing about it. The wedding day had come and gone so quickly, and Mrs. Papadopoulos had headed the whole affair. And Rodney had not been able to get a word in edgeways. So Rodney had reluctantly surrendered to a marriage he had never ever desired, by any manner of means. But with a child now on the way, and with Mr. Papadopoulos breathing down his back, he felt like a caged animal, with nowhere to run. The wedding had been held at a grandiose venue in Charleston, where no expense had been spared for the occasion. If there was any silver lining to this ominously grey cloud, Lisa's parents had generously brought the couple a gorgeous Georgian farmhouse in the Virginian countryside to Rodney's taste. Mr. Papadopoulos had got the most perfect pottery studio built for Rodney, whom had spent time as an apprentice under the expert tuition of a great potter, and since then Rodney had been producing masterpieces, which were often on display in some of the finest art galleries in the country, so Rodney had earned a name for himself. Lisa insisted on getting married before she began to show in her wedding dress, as she said she could not abide the prospect of being a fat bride. But 6 months after the wedding, she announced to Rodney that she had miscarried their baby, and the revelation hit Rodney hard. He did wonder if Lisa had been pregnant at all. She did not behave like a young woman who had miscarried. She just smiled and said, "Better luck next time, then." Lisa was used to getting exactly what she wanted. Had their wedding been part of a masterful manipulation, he would never know. One thing he did know was that he loathed his wife. Try as he might to make their relationship work, his spoilt, self-centered wife had few redeeming qualities, and he enjoyed any excuse in the book to be away from her. He encouraged her to go on holidays with her friends, and was always relieved when she was out of the way. In truth, he would have loved nothing better than for his wife to have an affair with another man, so that he could find the quintessential excuse to leave her, but that looked like it was never going to happen, as Lisa, for some incongruous, unexplainable reason, seemed to be head over heels in love with Rodney, which was unfathomable, as the love she had towards him was certainly not reciprocated. "That's no way to live, darling," her mother had told him. "You're very unhappy with Lisa, and I can't blame you, son. She's a frightful young lady. I don't believe I've ever met anyone more spoilt. Do you know, she threw away the Easter eggs I bought the both of you, because she was afraid of getting fat. I was absolutely appalled. At the very least, she could have given them back to me, or let someone less fortunate enjoy them. I remember after Thanksgiving she threw away perfectly good food. The wastage was absolutely insane. So much expensive, perfectly edible food flung into the dustbin. It made me recoil in disgust. I was completely revulsed. Even your dad was grievously upset to see that happen." "That's what she's like, Mum. She's so used to having everything she wants. She's developed this arrogant sense of self-entitlement. I think she sees me as something she owns, like one of her designer shoes or purse. I wish I could like her, but I don't. A marriage is not supposed to be like this, is it, Mum?" "Of course it isn't, son. Oh, I think you should get a divorce. I really do. I mean, you don't have any reason to stay in this relationship, as you don't have a baby to raise. I mean, if you really are so desperately unhappy, there is a way out." "Do you want to know the truth, Mum? Because I don't actually enjoy telling it. But I'm scared to divorce Lisa. If I do anything to hurt Lisa, there is no telling what Mr. Papadopoulos is capable of doing. He is the most threatening, dangerous man that I have ever met. Do you know he was arrested by the police once in a murder investigation, and is linked to a person that went missing?" Mrs. Van Vuren let out a gasp. "You're joking, right? Your father mentioned there were rumours of Mr. Papadopoulos being connected to organised crime. But I had no idea about this. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I only knew about it a short while ago. I actually told Lisa that her dad looked like he ran a drug cartel. We've been watching a movie together on this thug.
that was in charge of the Italian mafia, I believe it was. I swear to you, Mum, he looked like Mr. Papadopoulos, sleek dark hair, devious brown eyes, a thick gold chain around a very sizable neck. When I told Lisa as much, she thought it was hysterically funny, and then she boasted that her dad had been a person of interest in 2 police investigations, would you believe? I actually asked her if she thought he might have committed the crimes. And do you know what she said to me, Mum? Of course, silly. He's far too clever to get caught.
She said that to you, said Mrs. Van Vuren, her eyes widening in horror.
She did, Mum. Then she made a rather ominous joke. She poked her finger in my chest and said,
"So don't think about divorcing me, Rodney, because you just might go missing as well. And no one would ever know what the hell had happened to you."
That sounds like a threat, darling.
Do you think she knows you're unhappy in your marriage with her?
Of course she knows, Mum. I've even told her as much. But the funny thing is my apathetic indifference towards her makes her want me more.
Well, I suppose that might make some kind of sense, said Mrs. Van Vuren. She wants what she can't have, doesn't she? Your being very indifferent towards her is going to make her want you more. You should be playing your cards differently, son. You should act like you're so keen on her that she actually wants to push you away. It's not a bad idea, you know.
She'll see right through my act, Mum. I'm not going to be able to pull that kind of stunt off. I can't even bear to touch her. She makes my skin crawl.
Look, I could get my solicitor to draw up some divorce papers for you. And when the time is right, you could ask her to sign them. How about that?
Do what you want to do, Mum, but I'm not sure I've got the guts to divorce her. If her father wasn't around, it of course would be a different story. I've seen the men who work for him shaking in their boots, and even his own wife is scared of him to a certain extent.
And what about Lisa? Has she got any reservations about her father?
Oh, no. She's got him wrapped up around her little finger. He will do anything for his little princess. He made that very clear to me from the very beginning. He told me if I so much as hurt a tiny little pinky on her finger, I was a dead man.
Well, I must admit, I never warmed to the man at your wedding.
Even your father said he was the most frightful person he'd ever had the privilege to meet. Actually, in truth, I think the word he used was thug. Put it this way, Mum. I think it's not just selling bath stuff that has made him into a very wealthy man. I'm sure he has his fingers in some nefarious pies, but the police have never been able to pin a thing on him. As his daughter rightly says, he's too clever for that.
Rodney knew his mother was absolutely right, but divorcing Lisa Papadopoulos would certainly mean upsetting her father, and he was absolutely terrified of the man. This insidious man, with his beefcake-like appearance and Rottweiler face, looked like he ran a drug cartel, even though he was actually involved in selling bathroom fixtures and fittings to the rich and famous, would you believe? But certainly if you double-crossed him, there was no telling what he was capable of doing. When Mrs. Van Vuren got some divorce papers drawn up for her beloved son, Rodney looked at them longingly, as if they were dreamy holiday brochures to the Caribbean that he could ill afford. He wondered if he could ever persuade Lisa to sign them. Chance would be a fine thing, he thought, but maybe one day he could tell her that their relationship really was not working, and maybe one day she might just listen and hopefully agree. He hid the papers in a desk in his pottery studio and forgot all about them. 1 year later. It was Tuesday night at the pottery studio, and Rodney was giving a pottery class. People came to him in the evenings and worked until 11 o'clock at night, and then they would go home. Many of his students had jobs during the week and thoroughly enjoyed allowing their creative juices to flow and letting their hair down after a hard day in the office. The Tuesday group were a fun-loving team of students, all eager to become good potters. The banter in the evening class was jovial, humorous, light-hearted, and very relaxed, as indeed it always was. Rodney thoroughly enjoyed his pottery classes. It kept him away from his wife Lisa for a start. Recently she'd become even more belligerent, snapping at him tirelessly like a capricious crocodile.
Why don't you spend more time with me? You spend all your time in that damn studio, she would complain. You're never there for me.
It's because whenever I'm around you, I find you clingy and very needy. I feel as if I need to escape so that I can breathe.
I'm only clinging because I want to be around you. What's wrong with that, Rodney? Most men appreciate being needed.
Most men appreciate being able to breathe first, Rodney had corrected her, and most men would like a wife who didn't have a tantrum if everything didn't go their way. You constantly report back to your father about me, and that's not easy to take.
That's because my dad, unlike you, actually has my back.
You can say that again. I mean, we've been married for over 8 years, and you act like an insecure teenager.
That's because I know that you have never loved me, Rodney.
Lisa, I told you that when I married you. I told you I didn't love you. Nothing has changed on that score. But you were the one that insisted we got married. I told you it would be a laborious struggle if there was no spark between us. But you were most insistent that we get married for the sake of our baby. But our baby never came along, did it? So here we are, trapped in a loveless marriage.
What are you saying, Rodney? That I made up my pregnancy to trap you into this marriage?
I'm saying no such thing. But what I am saying, Lisa, is that you can do so much better than me. You deserve to find a man that will love you back and make you truly happy.
So you want a divorce? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying anything of the kind, Lisa. The ball is entirely in your court. That's what I'm saying. But what I am saying is, should you wish to end our marriage, I will be very agreeable.
Well, that's never going to happen, Rodney. We're together for life, you and me, in sickness and in health. We made that vow together when we got married, and we stood in front of the pastor.
I had no idea you took our marriage vows so seriously, Lisa.
How dare you, Rodney? Of course I did. I did.
One of the students at Rodney's pottery studio was a man called Peter Neeson, who had told him that his pottery classes with Rodney had helped him heal from his wife's death, far more efficiently than any of his grief therapy. It takes my focus off myself, he explained. I put all my energy into making something beautiful, and then my life feels so much less pitiful. It helps me feel much more optimistic about the world. The other students heartily agreed that a creative outlet had made them discover more colour in their lives.
My husband does woodwork, said a woman called Selina, and I do pottery. We both need time away from our cell phones, the offices, and our children. The pottery studio for me is my place for rejuvenation, and when I make a pot, I feel a great sense of accomplishment. I never feel that same level of achievement when I'm at work, when I calculate the monthly takings, or when I've cleaned up the house, only for it to get messy all over again. But when I make a pot, I've got something to show for my work, and that is a very satisfactory feeling indeed. It was after tea break at about 10 o'clock that they heard the ominous sound of heavy boots thundering towards the studio door, moving at an efficiently fast pace. Then there was an unpleasant, loud rapping sound at the studio door. But before Rodney could answer the door, it was swung open. Everyone looked up, somewhat startled from their clay pots, to observe who could be intruding on them so rudely at this late time of the night. It had been such a pleasant evening up till now, but being interrupted so impertinently like this was not a good feeling. Rodney's knees almost crumbled beneath him when he saw Mr. Papadopoulos standing there in the pottery studio, leering at him with a murderous expression on his face, which not only served to intimidate Rodney, but his entire pottery class. For the insolent man glared fiercely at everyone through fiery brown eyes, and his powerful biceps bulged from beneath his white shirt, as he punched the air in indignation, pointing his thick finger at Rodney accusingly. "How dare you, Rodney?" said Mr. Papadopoulos,
not caring about the interested audience of pupils now watching him.
"I've just been speaking on the phone to my daughter. She's in a terrible state, crying like a baby she is. You've broken my little princess's heart, and you better bloody fix up this mess. She tells me you've been hinting about a divorce."
All the pupils in the pottery studio glanced at each other. So this must be Rodney's father-in-law, they mused to themselves. Not a very likeable man.
"You know what I said to you, Rodney, when you married my daughter? Or have you conveniently got a shorter memory than I suspected you'd have? I told you that if you ever so much as hurt her little Pinky, I would—"
He growled venomously at Rodney, his legs thumping the ground like a trumpeting elephant.
"Look, Mr. Papadopoulos, I don't mean to be rude, but can we please take this outside? Not in front of my pupils, please,"
he said, removing a torch from the shelf.
"Fair enough," said Mr. Papadopoulos, nodding at the pupils. "I apologise for the intrusion," he said. "Let's go outside, then. A walk in the woodgrove might be nice."
Selina's account. I have been one of Rodney's pottery pupils for over 6 years now, so I've known him for a long time. I hasten to say he is one of the nicest people I've ever had the privilege to meet, who is a master at his craft. One day I decided my life was far too pedestrian. I was reading a book on how I could step out of my comfort zone, to do something different to change my life. And that was when I decided to take up pottery classes, which became a huge passion for me, under Rodney's masterful tuition. I was producing some quality work. I never saw Rodney's wife much, but when Lisa did come into the pottery studio, I did find myself wondering how someone like Rodney could have married someone so obnoxious. She'd come into the studio and wasn't afraid to have a good old gripe at Rodney in front of the whole class. I could see she was a self-entitled brat, used to getting her own way. Her conversation with Rodney would go something like this.
"But I want to go on that cruise with you. Daddy is going to pay. It'll be a month away for us. It'll be amazing."
To which Rodney would reply,
"I'm sorry, Lisa, but I can't go. I've already taken too much leave off this year. But why don't you go without me?"
The woman would become belligerent.
"You're such a spoil-sport, Rodney. I can't believe how utterly selfish you are being." "Look, Lisa, I'm not trying to be difficult, but I'm very busy. I have clients waiting for my pots on order. I've scheduled pottery classes to teach. I can't just abandon everything at will. I have responsibilities." "Who cares about them? Dad'll give you the money you need to cover any shortfalls." "That's not the problem, Lisa." "What about your responsibility to me? I am your wife, in case you've forgotten,"
she would say, straddling her hands on her hips and rolling her eyes indignantly at the back of her head.
"Lisa, this is not about money. It's about integrity. I don't want to let my customers down, do I? Besides, I do have some dignity. I don't want to go through life living on your father's handouts. I'm happy to support the both of us without his interference. I'm quite capable of managing our financial affairs without him."
"What on earth is wrong with you, Rodney? Most normal people wouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth like you do. But oh, I forgot, Rodney. You're so not normal," she would say, scrunching up her face disapprovingly. "I guess I'll have to go on the cruise on my own then. It's typical of you to let me down. What am I going to say to people? My husband's got too many responsibilities with his clay pots. How pathetic is that going to sound?" she said, hitting a chair so hard that it somersaulted across the floor, landing on its side. "You're pathetic, Rodney," she'd say, storming out of the studio. I felt very sorry for Rodney. He would apologise for the fortuitous outburst, and we would continue to work, as if nothing had happened, but we could all sense the tension between the couple. It didn't take a rocket scientist to feel that Rodney and his wife had a tumultuous relationship, and although he never discussed his personal life, I guessed he was exceedingly unhappy in his marriage. By all accounts, it would take a saint to be married to such a difficult, tempestuous, overbearing woman, and all the men at the studio certainly said as much. When Rodney was not around to hear our discussions, of course. We all did wonder why Rodney did not divorce the woman, and soon learnt why he'd refrained from getting a divorce. Rodney was clearly terribly afraid of his father-in-law, Mr. Papadopoulos, and who could blame him? When Rodney's capriciously belligerent father-in-law thundered into the studio late on Tuesday night, shouting the odds at Rodney in front of the entire class, let's just say he was without doubt one of the scariest, most cantankerous men I have ever seen. He reminded me of those thuggish gangsters you see on crime movies, who don't hesitate to execute anyone who betrays them. The kind of man who would have a decapitated head on his desk to put the fear of God in anyone daring to think of not serving his every demand faithfully. Rodney did not want his father-in-law to discuss the personal issues he was having with his wife in front of the entire pottery studio, and who could blame him for that? But certainly in hindsight I wish he had aired all his dirty linen in front of us, because there's safety in numbers. I didn't have a good feeling when Rodney left the studio with this odorous man to have a discussion out of doors. I hoped he wouldn't say anything to this volatile man, who had the potential to explode like a landmine. He appeared to me in every way to be exceedingly dangerous. Let's just say, when Mr. Papadopoulos and Rodney left the studio, me and the other pottery students stared at each other in abject horror. The first thing I said to the pupils is, "That man is dangerous. Did you see he was carrying a revolver in his hoti? I don't like his dark energy. He's extremely sinister." "Aren't you being a little dramatic, Selina?" Peter said gingerly. "I mean, granted, his father-in-law looks malicious, but he's hardly going to hurt Rodney. Rodney is his son-in-law, for goodness sake." I wasn't sure that Peter was right. One always learnt that murders in people's lives were usually rather close to home. I pretended I needed to leave the pottery studio to get a tool of mine for the pot I was making, which I claimed to have left in the car. To my horror, I could see Mr. Papadopoulos leading Rodney into the woodgrove. I heard him say, "If you don't want your students to hear what I have to say to you, let's go for a walk in the woodgrove." "I'm not sure that's a good idea," Rodney had said. "It's quite dark in there." "Well, we've got your torch, have we not?" Mr. Papadopoulos said. I didn't like the sound of any of this, so I trotted over to my car and grabbed a torch, along with a baseball bat that I kept in my truck at all times. I clandestinely followed the two men through the trees. It was a dark, inauspicious night. I say that because there was a cool breeze blowing, but it was making a slight wailing sound, and then there were these strange howling sounds coming from within the woodgrove that were hauntingly airy and made me quiver uneasily. The night hung around me like a thick black blanket. The light of the moon had been rudely expunged. Even the stars could not be seen scribbling their twinkling lights over the sky. It was as if the thick cover of dark mist had concealed all their light, which made venturing into the woods all the more daunting for me. I'd never been keen on the dark. I'd always been terribly nervous driving home at night after a pottery class, but Rodney's lessons made the trips worth my while and helped me conquer my reservations. I could hear the loud, angry voices of the two men talking, and I chose to discreetly follow behind them, despite my obvious reluctance. I was concerned about Rodney's welfare. I didn't trust this man a single inch. Why did he need to talk to Rodney in the woods? Was it so he could be far away from the prying eyes of the pottery students? The man gave off such a bodeful, uncouth energy. "Look, Mr. Papadopoulos," I heard Rodney saying, "I don't know what Lisa has told you, but please don't overreact about this. Yes, I am sorry she's upset. I didn't intentionally mean to hurt her. Upset? My daughter is devastated. Not only does she say you have never loved her, but that you are actually asking her for a divorce indirectly. My daughter does not want a divorce with you, Rodney. Do you understand what I'm saying? God only knows what she sees in you. Personally, I would have been so much happier if she'd married a high-profile Greek man, but she chose you. And under no circumstances are you going to leave my daughter. Do you understand me? Because if you do, I will make your life a living hell. And believe me, you Rodney, you haven't got the faintest clue what I am capable of. If you remember, Mr. Papadopoulos, there was no choice in our marriage, Rodney boldly interceded. We married because Lisa was pregnant. We were not in love, and there's never been any connection between us. Correction! You might not have been in love with my daughter, Rodney, but Lisa was very much in love with you from the very beginning, and you knew that. Of course I know that, Mr. Papadopoulos, but it wasn't reciprocated. My daughter married you, Rodney. She is your wife. You are responsible for her, and you are going to treat her like a queen, or I will bloody kill you. Do you understand that? I will kill you without any hesitation. No one treats my little Lisa with disrespect, and if they do, I will make them regret it. Please don't threaten me, Mr. Papadopoulos. The two men continued to argue together. I noticed Mr. Papadopoulos was getting more and more unhinged, and I suspect it was because Rodney was standing up for himself for the first time in his entire life, and was saying to him a few home truths that he didn't want to hear. It alarmed me. I don't know why Rodney was being so assertive in the woods. It made him exceedingly vulnerable. Now was not the time to stand up for himself in the presence of such a big, intimidating bully. When I saw Mr. Papadopoulos's fingers fiddling with his revolver on his holty, I wondered if he was planning to suddenly shoot Rodney. He certainly was getting hot under the collar. I reasoned with myself that this man would not dare to harm Rodney. There were several witnesses back at the pottery studio who would know that if anything untoward had happened to Rodney, Mr. Papadopoulos would be likely to blame. Slippery men like him weren't stupid. As I was following the two men into the woods, I sensed someone else was tagging behind me. I thought maybe it was one of the pottery students. I felt a wee bit annoyed. I'm not sure why I felt annoyed. You'd think I'd appreciate the company. I gleaned the only reason they were following me was because they were incredibly snoopy, very curious about what the men were talking about. And I knew who it was. I was certain it was Angelica Button. That was the one pupil in our class that was an unquenchable gossip. She was not being very discreet, but I absolutely knew she was there. I wasn't stupid. I could hear a twig breaking and feet tagging behind me very clandestinely. I chose to willfully ignore her, even though I wanted to hiss at her and tell her to leave me the hell alone. But such foolish actions might have made both men aware of my presence, and I was here to watch over Rodney, to make absolutely certain he wasn't in danger. Mr. Papadopoulos and Rodney had stopped for a moment. They were talking in an open clearing in the woods. Their words were not discernible to me, but I knew by Mr. Papadopoulos's inflammatory gestures that he was not impressed by any manner of means. While I was discreetly hiding behind a tree, peering curiously at the two men, whom had become less ambiguous and obscure, as suddenly the woods had become a whole lot lighter. I realized it was because the moon had come out, like the sun after the rain. It audaciously trespassed through the open branches of the trees. Its silvery ethereal light lit up the whole area, and with Rodney's high-powered torchlight, the intimidating darkness had greatly receded. I will admit I felt the tight tension in my chest ebbing away, like the smoke from a chimney. I was still very much on edge. I was afraid that Mr. Papadopoulos was about to beat up his son-in-law, and I couldn't allow that to happen. If needs must, I would whack him hard at the back of his head with a baseball bat to render him unconscious for a while, in order to rescue my pottery teacher from his wrath. Had he cunningly lured his son-in-law into the woodgrove to beat him up within an inch of his life, to teach him a lesson? Maybe he didn't want to kill his son-in-law, but he had in mind to hurt him badly. I suspected as much. My hands trembled as I contemplated what I must do. The energy between the two men was getting heated, as Mr. Papadopoulos was pointing an accusing finger at Rodney. I could see his face jiggling with indignation, and the muscle on his jaw clenched tightly. In that precise moment, I could feel Angelica's body brushing against mine, as she too was impertinently peering through the trees with me. The nerve of the woman, I thought. Bloody cheek! Did that woman have absolutely no boundaries? Did she know nothing about giving people their personal space? I gave her a slight angry push to express my level of annoyance, and she pushed me back. Now I could feel the anger coursing through me like a steam train. I turned around to give her a glare, but it wasn't Angelica standing next to me. It was a young, curious male Bigfoot.
I'm not sure how I actually knew that this Bigfoot was young, as it certainly looked like an adult, standing up on two legs at easily over 7 foot tall and possibly 600 pounds. But I knew it was a youngling that hadn't fully grown into his body yet. The Bigfoot's expressive face was startlingly human. He possessed an excitable, callow, juvenile energy, as if he naively, whimsically thought we were playing a wonderful, exciting game of hide and seek. I would normally have been terrified of such an imposing creature, but I could see by the expression in his animated treacle-coloured eyes that he thought we were embroiled in an exciting game together, of which he wanted to play an intrinsic part, so I knew he was totally harmless. I was completely bemused to be standing next to such an outlandish creature, but I couldn't allow his presence to steal my focus. At that precise moment, I noticed that Mr. Papadopoulos had grabbed Rodney by the collar of his shirt, and that was when I sprang into action, rushing through the trees towards Mr. Papadopoulos with a baseball bat in my hand, and the Bigfoot running behind me. Of course, I didn't know he was doing that at this stage. I began to swing the bat precariously in my hands, trying to aim at Mr. Papadopoulos's head, with very little success. The swings of my bat were most ungainly. Mr. Papadopoulos seemed to be staring past me, not at me, his face growing a funny shade of green, his eyes growing wide with terror. Mr. Papadopoulos was frightened of my baseball bat. I could hardly believe it. I've never seen a grown man trembling so much before. I mean, at 145 pounds, I was hardly that intimidating, was I? Mr. Papadopoulos tried to say something. His mouth opened and closed like a startled goldfish. He clutched his chest tightly and went falling backwards onto the ground. It was then that I realized it was not me that had caused Mr. Papadopoulos to shudder in terror, but the male Bigfoot behind me, who was waving his arms around like I had been doing with the baseball bat, to mimic me, and his movements looked very threatening. I suppose, in the circumstances, it wasn't surprising that Mr. Papadopoulos was so alarmed. The Bigfoot looked disappointed to see that Mr. Papadopoulos was now lying on the ground, motionless, as if he really thought the fun game had finally come to a disappointing end. We heard a strange, unusual call from the woods. It sounded like a voice calling the name, "Hasta! Hasta!" The Bigfoot looked down at Mr. Papadopoulos, and then up at me, and he looked at Rodney, his face registering bitter disappointment. I guessed his mum was calling him from the trees. Then I heard the words in my head. "My mum's calling me. I can't play any more. I'm sorry, I have to go." He patted me on the back like a good old friend. "Great game," he said to me telepathically. Then he was gone like greased lightning, swinging his arms backwards and forwards, as on nimble athletic feet he charged through the trees like a bullet. "What the hell?" said Rodney. "A Bigfoot? I never expected to see one of those things. I didn't even know they were real. Did you see how human his face was?" Rodney got onto his knees, was leaning over his father-in-law, slapping his face. "Mr. Papadopoulos! Mr. Papadopoulos, can you hear me? Mr. Papadopoulos, are you all right? Please say something." But Mr. Papadopoulos did not move. His face was as white as a piece of paper. Rodney looked at me through bewildered eyes. "I think he's had a heart attack," he said. He was terrified of the Bigfoot. His heart just stopped in panic. "But the Bigfoot was only a youngling. He was harmless," I insisted. "You didn't see how he was throwing his arms around. A strong creature like that. Very intimidating, I assure you." "He was just mimicking me," I insisted. "People can die of shock, you know," said Rodney, as he tried to attempt CPR in vain on Mr. Papadopoulos. But his attempts were fruitless, and when the emergency services arrived, they announced him dead. But I could have told Rodney that from the moment that Mr. Papadopoulos fell over, because his eyes were glazed over like a dead fish. I was to learn later that Mr. Papadopoulos had great issues with his heart. He was taking warfarin, a blood thinner, and suffered from ventricle fibrillation, an irregular heartbeat. I genuinely think he died of shock because he saw the Bigfoot. But if the truth be told, I felt relief that such an obnoxious character was finally gone. There was no telling what he was capable of. I considered him a volatile and dangerous man. Rodney's final comments. When Lisa found out what had happened, she was devastated, blaming me for everything that had happened. She hurled herself at me and began slapping me. "You upset my dad so much. He had a massive heart attack because of you. You knew he had issues with his heart. He's had issues for a long time," she said, spitting venom at me. "I don't know why the hell I ever married you. I want a divorce," she demanded. Little did she realize that her own father had died from a cardiac arrest brought on by the stress of seeing a juvenile Bigfoot throwing his arms around in a threatening manner, and the sheer terror of encountering such an outlandish creature he thought was about to kill him had brought on the heart attack. But I had no intention of telling Lisa that. These days, I swear, if it wasn't for that male Bigfoot, I would be stuck in my miserable marriage with Lisa. So perhaps every single cloud does indeed have a silver lining. Let's just say there were not many people desperately sad to see the last of Mr. Papadopoulos, and Mrs. Papadopoulos wasn't even very aggrieved herself. And on learning her daughter was getting a divorce from me, she began to flirt outrageously. "Oh, Rodney, I did hear about your divorce, that you're getting divorced with my daughter. Well, in the circumstances, I was thinking the two of us might get together at some point. I do assure you, you won't be disappointed. Older women can be so exciting," she said. Let's just say that was enough to make me move away as fast as I could to escape the licentious woman. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Carly Fournier was attending to the weeds in her front yard that were sprouting through the red brick driveway with her kettle of boiling water. It was a nifty trick she'd picked up somewhere on a gardening website. She found this natural way of attacking the weeds successfully destroyed these uninvited rogue visitors that had trespassed so rudely in the tiny crevices between the brick paving. Their unsightly, ugly, unwelcome appearance always niggled her greatly. Carly wasn't obsessive-compulsive about anything in her life. On the contrary, she was relaxed, carefree, rather easy-going. But invasively aggressive weeds on a driveway bothered her sense of order like nothing else, and she went after her weeds with the aggression of a hive of bees being robbed of their honey. She knew her hang-ups about curb appeal were indelibly rooted in the past and hard to shake off, like the thorny briars snagged on a T-shirt after having walked through a thicket. She and her brother Larry had been raised in an upmarket Montreal neighbourhood, where the houses were pristine and magnificently beautiful. Many were high-end renovation projects that looked as if no expense had been spared. Windows gleamed without apology, with not even a smudge or smear mark in sight. Houses were freshly painted in crisp neutral colours, and yards were pristinely mown to perfection, displaying fabulous colourful flower beds, all summer and spring. The neighbourhood was proud, pompous, rather haughty, and appearances mattered for street cred in this part of Montreal. As is always the case, there was one house in the neighbourhood that invariably let the side down, and it was Carly Fournier's parents' house that wore an expression of gloom on its outer facade, and stuck out like a sore thumb in the neighbourhood. It looked abandoned, forsaken, forgotten, rather lost. The weeping walls looked more brown than white, and were practically begging for a new lick of paint, while burgeoning ivy was rambling around the house like verdant tentacles that wanted to strangle anything it touched. When Carly was young, she recalled having to snap the tenacious vines herself when they started to crawl through her bedroom window, and were threatening to lay down their sticky appendages across her internal walls. The once pristine pale green wooden shutters had faded to an off-cream colour, and the wood was beginning to become warped, as it hadn't been treated, and even the front door had buckled extensively, so you had to give it a huge shove to try and open it, as it was always getting stuck on its hinges due to the wood that had expanded and contracted from damp, cold, heat, and seasonal changes. The driveway had been overtaken by weeds and knee-high seeded grass, had confiscated the entire yard, and was tangled up with briars and ugly weeds. It looked so unkempt, so neglected, so untamed, as if the yard had a mind of its own and was doing what the hell it liked. It was hard to believe the house was actually occupied, for if you had driven down that street in that particular neighbourhood in Montreal, you would have assumed that the house must be abandoned, forsaken, unloved, and definitely unoccupied, and the locals would pretend as much, to explain away the embarrassment and eyesore on the street that left them all blushing with shame. Yet the truth was, behind the derelict, sad facade lived a family, a very loving family at that was possibly richer than most of the entire neighbourhood put together, with bank accounts practically hemorrhaging interest. But you would never have believed that for a moment, as why would any family overlook and forsake the general maintenance of their home? The Fourniers did not concern themselves with such mundane trivialities. Their attitude was, "I'll do it tomorrow." The Fourniers were possibly the laziest people you could ever hope to meet, for they loved nothing better than to lounge around on the sofa all day, reading novels, fabulous books, watching television, ordering takeout, smoking cigarettes, drinking beers, and enjoying long conversations about everything and nothing. Mr. Fournier was brilliant at television quizzes, and he'd hoot out all the answers with effortless ease. If he had been on a television game show, he'd have walked away with the grand prize and the jackpot, but he was just too lazy to bother entering something like that. Mr. Fournier was often described as a walking Encyclopaedia Britannica, for he knew the strangest things. Despite the Fourniers' lackadaisical, slovenly approach to life, they were incredibly nice, genuinely warm people, funny, clever, and loving. But one of their less than redeeming qualities was they were both afflicted with the deadly disease of being bone idle, which meant doing the bare minimum was the preferable choice. The roof was lucky to escape without being damaged, because much like the rest of the house, it might have fallen apart had it not been carefully attended to. But Carly's parents knew that a problematic roof could invite all kinds of issues into the house, like dry rot and mould, sinking ceilings, and other disasters. So thankfully they attended to that, but everything else they put on the back burner for another day, which invariably never came. Luckily the interior of the house was quite cosy, although inclined to become rather messy. Mr. Fournier, who was Carly and Larry's father, was like a big, fat, blubbery walrus with several chins and long white sideburns like white, narrow, hairy strips on either side of his face. Let's just say Mr. Fournier spent his days and nights parked on the sofa, watching sports games, reading all kinds of incredible books, and drinking beer as if he was dying of dehydration and had an insatiable thirst that could not be satisfied. Carly clandestinely privately thought that her father at times looked as dilapidated and time-worn as the house itself, as his long white ruffled hair looked like it had had an unfortunate run-in with a tornado, and had never seen a hairdresser's pruning shears a day in his life, something which he boasted about regularly with a great deal of pride, as if it was something to be proud of. "I'll have you know these fine locks of mine have not been attended to by a barber in years," he would say. Mr. Fournier would wear jogging pants with holes in them, and string vests in summer, because they were comfortable and cool, as he didn't care a hoot about what he looked like, or what people actually thought of him, but he enjoyed being as comfortable as he possibly could, which was why he almost always wore slippers on his feet. In the winter every year, Mr. Fournier would wear an old Christmas sweater with a Santa Claus and his reindeer on it, long before and after Christmas was over, as he was very attached to the old beloved thing sentimentally, and it was a gift from his mother, and he wore it as often as he could to feel close to her. Suffice to say, Mrs. Fournier suffered from her husband's indolence, but perhaps her husband's lackadaisical ways had somehow inadvertently rubbed off on her, and she'd caught the lethargic infection. She would lounge casually in front of the television, listening to her favourite television programmes, with packets of sweeties balanced on her lap, and scoff the lot, littering the floor with a confetti of sweet wrappers. Her sugar addiction was fierce,
and had consumed her life, but sugar can be more addictive than cocaine. Twice a week she would visit the old sweet shop in town, buying buckets of candy that she claimed were for kids' birthday parties, as admitting they were for herself made her feel rather bashful and self-conscious. She desired to do the bare minimum of housework, as she claimed she was far too tired, but with so much sugar circulating around in her bloodstream, her pancreas was probably overworked and very fatigued. The family did not live in squalor, but you might believe that based on the exterior of the home, with all its peeling paint and old roses that looked like they hadn't been pruned in many years. The grass was always unkept and the wooden windows buckling, clearly having seen better days. Carly and her brother would often return home to find her parents passed out on the couch, her father usually with a cigarette dangling out of the edge of his mouth and a beer can in his hand, while their mother looked like she'd been playing darts with sweet papers and would be snoring so loudly her mouth would hang open like a flycatcher. "Oh, you're back, sweetheart," her mother would say, suddenly opening her eyes, one after the other. "Would you be a love, darling, and put the kettle on for some tea? And maybe bring me some of those brownies that I bought at the baker's for us." The kids were used to doing things for their parents when they were parked on the sofa like two cars that had run out of gas and just could not move. Carly often wondered what it would have been like if her father had not inherited such a sizable, vast fortune. He might be forced to get off his lazy backside and do something for a living. Instead, he was living off the rich fruits he had inherited from his father, and it would seem he and his wife had no intentions of working a day in their lives if they could possibly help it. Let's just say on his deathbed, Chuck's own father had said to him, "I worry about leaving you all this money, Chuck. You're lazy by nature. Your wife ain't much better than you are. I'm concerned you'll never work again. You don't have any ambition, do you? That's not healthy. Too much money can do that to a man, and it's not good. Working gives you a reason to get up in the morning, a purpose. I found it did that for me." Even though his father considered leaving his wealth to his housekeeper, at the end of the day, blood was thicker than water, and he couldn't do it, even though he knew he was giving his son the license to never ever work again. And that is exactly what happened. His predictions came true. You would think the Fourniers had no excuse not to spend any money on their house, but they really couldn't be bothered. It was too much like hard work to organise a gardening team or some handyman to attend to their house, someone who might intrude on their peace and tranquillity, invading their privacy. Carly always pondered why on earth her father didn't want to attend to the lawn or get the shutters repaired and the walls repainted, why he wouldn't hire outside help like many people in the neighbourhood did. Carly's mother would sink into the couch and say, "Chuck, I think you need to attend to the lawn." He would raise an unkempt, white, bushy eyebrow, rub his chin reflectively and say, "Yes, the grass is rather long, isn't it? It could do with a good trim." "You could always get a gardener," his wife suggested. "I know the Brixtons have one that's very good. Then you wouldn't have to bother in doing it yourself." Carly's father had chuckled. "I told you, my cherub. I've got it all sorted. I'll do it tomorrow." The problem was tomorrow would never come. And even if it did, and Mr. Fournier made a start on the lawn, halfway through the project he would be sweating like a pig and abandon it for a break, and then never return to the job that he'd started, claiming he'd got far too hot, it was tediously boring, or he fancied a break. As a result, the lawn never got attended to, and sometimes a few anonymous, rather rude notes would appear on the Fourniers' front doorstep with comments like, "Your house is letting the street down. You should be utterly ashamed of yourself. What the hell is wrong with you? Have you no pride or self-respect? Or are you just far too poor and impoverished to live in this neighbourhood? If you are, then just bugger off. You're not wanted around here, nor are you welcome." Other notes would say, "Why the hell don't you people move? We don't want you here ruining the tone of our neighbourhood."
On one occasion, someone in the street had sent a gardening team along to the Fourniers' house, free of charge, to clear up the yard and to mow their lawn for them. But Carly's parents took offence to such a brazen intrusion and sent the team away. Mr. Fournier had told the well-meaning young man, "Please leave. I've got my lawn under control. It's a bit long at the moment, and there are a few weeds, but I will get it sorted. I don't need you people interfering." "The bloody cheek of it," Carly's mother would say. "Some people just don't mind their own business, do they? I think we should get our grass to grow even longer, to get their backs up, don't you? That'll show them. The people in this neighbourhood are such snobs. It's insane." "Here's to that," said Carly's father. "Down with the snobs, I say." He raised a beer can to his mouth and took a jovial swig. Carly and her brother Larry were very embarrassed by the exterior of their home, so much so that they never invited people back to the property, because they were young and impressionable, and other people's opinions mattered to them. So they didn't inform their parents that there was a teachers' meeting in the evening after school, or a sports event that they were partaking in. They didn't want the other kids at school to laugh at the slovenly appearance of their parents. Carly would die of humiliation if her dad rocked up in his string vest and jogging pants to a teacher's evening, looking like something that the cat dragged in. And as for her mother, she always looked as if she'd been sleeping in her clothes for an entire week. They always appeared incredibly crumpled. The Fourniers did have regular friends, of course, visiting the house, who just knew an unkempt yard was typical of the Fourniers and never judged them for that. But people who knew them loved them dearly, as Mr. Fournier could make you laugh so much that you would leave the house feeling as if you'd really enjoyed yourself, as your belly would be aching so much from laughing. Mr. Fournier should have been a stand-up comedian, because he would never have disappointed his audience. It had been a tough childhood, growing up in a neighbourhood with a house that looked like a shack, amongst all these palatial, grandiose mansions in Montreal. Carly and her brother would leave home to walk to school when it was dark outside, usually bitterly cold, with an Arctic wind blowing against their skins. Their hands would be freezing through their woolly gloves, and they would be blowing out cold white mist from their nostrils. They would return home frozen to the bone, when it was still dark outside. You could forget their parents giving them a lift. They were probably lying passed out by a snug warm fire. One evening, it was so cold outside, and their much-loved cat Sylvia had been left out of doors by mistake all night. She'd been forgotten about. So when Carly opened the door the following morning, the poor cat's fur was frozen to the doorstep. You had to pull her away like Velcro from the step, and she was a sorry sight indeed, but luckily very much alive. Days later, Sylvia had moved into the house next door, where she'd found for herself a cushier lifestyle, where old Mrs. Garnier poached salmon for her every day. And better still, they had a cat flap fitted for Sylvia, which meant that she'd never be abandoned in the snow again. The next-door neighbour's yard was pristine, and better still, Mrs. Garnier had cat TV for Sylvia from the living-room window, as she would literally cover the bird table there with seeds and peanuts. And so for Sylvia, surrounded by the warmth of a wood-burning stove, curled up on a comfortable couch, she could observe all the bird life from the living-room window without getting her paws remotely cold. Sylvia, of course, still loved the Fourniers very much, visiting them regularly, but she knew what side her bread was buttered, and Sylvia discerned that Mrs. Garnier could offer her a far more luxurious lifestyle. Even though Carly's parents were the quintessential couch potatoes that were married to sofa world, despite everything, they were remarkably good people, with kind hearts and great senses of humour. But they had no comprehension how much their children were affected by the shabby condition of their home, and had they known this, they would have gone to the ends of the earth to rectify things for their children. When Carly and her brother were older and much more responsible, Larry transformed the yard of their home, mowing it every week, planting beds of the most colourful, vibrant flowers, painting the house, restoring the tattered shutters, while Carly transformed the interiors of their home, making it comfortable and cosy. She taught herself how to cook,
She prepared the family healthier meals, and then their house was no longer the embarrassment and shame of the street in Montreal. But one thing that remained ever the same was that Carly's parents were as lazy as ever, only ever leaving the house for a supermarket shop, to buy sweets from the store or ice cream from the parlour, or visit the occasional good friend. But beyond that, her parents were like two lovable hibernating bears who thoroughly enjoyed remaining homebound all year round. It was hardly a wonder when Carly finally did leave home and got married, and she moved into a pretty Montreal neighbourhood with her husband Robert, that she was determined never to be that unsightly house on the street again, that everyone believed was abandoned and derelict. So on this unassuming day she was fastidiously attending to the weeds, and was unprepared for what was about to happen next, which was to put a spanner in the works and bring chaos to order, which was something that Carly could not abide. She had been fastidiously pouring this hot water over the weeds that peered at her tauntingly through the red brick paving, so the piping hot water caused the verdant leaves to shrink and curl up in disgust. She felt a measure of satisfaction to see them wilt like spinach in a steaming pot. "I've got you," she said with a sense of accomplishment. "You're not welcome to encroach on my driveway. Do you understand? Now get lost and die, will you?" The next thing she became aware of was a shadowy figure in her peripheral vision, wearing a glimmer of red, that went rocketing past her. It was her 5-year-old son Oliver, riding his 2-wheel bike, cycling straight into the road with an unabashful confidence, clearly oblivious of the potential danger he was in, as he thought he was immortal and accidents only ever happened in the movies, and when he smashed his toy cars into each other for fun on the oakwood floors in the lounge. "Oliver! Oliver!" she cried frantically, dashing after him in her wedge flip-flops. She tripped over her feet. "Oliver! Come back! Oliver!" Carly's heart began to flutter violently in her chest like a frightened bird. Her twitching stomach churned and began to twist and contort. She feared the very worst as she ran helplessly down the long ribbon of asphalt, screaming after her son, who appeared to be tone-deaf or was wilfully ignoring her urgent pleas. She was consumed with a dreadful feeling of impending dread, as if she was anticipating something quite frightful was about to unfold. Oliver could be obstinate at the very best of times, delighting in being stubborn and causing his parents distress. He seemed to enjoy ruffling his parents' feathers. She scanned the street for oncoming traffic, sighing with relief when the neighbourhood looked peaceful and rather quiet. One woman on the sidewalk was walking her 2 black pugs, who were ambitiously sniffing the manicured green turf and leaving their signature scent marks on every available tree that they could find. One appeared to be doing a funny handstand while it peed. This quiet, prepossessing, elegant, historic street in Montreal was basking in the luxuriant memories of the past, wearing each day that transpired in the fabric of our world as comfortably as the next, rather like a necklace of pearls around a woman's throat. The street was restfully enjoying yet another day, as it had done every other day before, wallowing blissfully in a congenial tranquillity, and was unflustered, unperturbed, and not concerned by the drama being birthed down the grey ribbon of asphalt, as Carly's shrieks rudely perforated the serene, salient ambience. The desperate, distorted, high-pitched screams echoed down the street, bouncing against the walls and windows of people's houses, who may have mistaken the sound for a goose flying above their homes, for they would often fly past the houses in great flocks, and Carly's screams were very similar to their shrieks. She frantically called after her son, the tone of her voice withered by trepidation, sharpened by angst. Thank God he was wearing his helmet. The little leaf European linden trees on either side of the road were flapping their branches wildly, like open umbrellas beating in the wind, as a breeze seemed to be blowing quite feistily on this pretty spring morning, while trinklets of pretty sunlight danced through the trees, casting soft shadows over the road. The lofty Gothic Revival homes in the neighbourhood, with their elegant pointed arched windows, doors, dormers and gables, appeared to be reticently detached and composed, as if the entire street was sunbathing under the radiant prisms of light on this pleasant, unassuming morning. Then she heard it, before she saw it.
The dreadful, discomposing, unsettling, high-frequency clunking and grinding sound of wheels accelerating on tarmac, getting closer and closer and closer as her son obliviously cycled down the road. It felt as if she was watching a horror movie with bated breath, anticipating what would come next. The strangled cries from within her failed to be articulated audibly. But as a mother, her scream seemed to echo through her entire body. Her heart swung like a pendulum, and every organ in her body jolted in anticipation. "Get off the road, Oliver!" she managed to scream, but it was all too late. The car, a red Honda Civic, brazenly came into view at the speed of a seagull, launching itself unsuspectingly towards someone's sandwich. The car was going way too fast to stop in time. Carly knew unequivocally that her son was going to collide with this car, and there was not a damn thing she could do about it. In that moment she was certain that she was witnessing the harrowing very last moments of her son's life. The car rammed into the side of his bicycle, throwing the bike off balance, so that the forward momentum meant her son was flung forwards on the handlebars and directly onto the sidewalk. She was cursing that her husband had taken the plastic training wheels off Oliver's bike, for he had whizzed down the road so fast, like the wind, without his speed being restrained or discouraged. By all accounts, there just had been no stopping him. She ran down the asphalt as fast as she possibly could, not caring about her own safety at all. None of that mattered. All she cared about was little Oliver. Her stomach was hollow with dread. She was inwardly screaming, but her fear had extinguished her voice like the light from a candle. The contorted bicycle lay buckled, distorted and crumpled by her son's side. His body appeared motionless and unmoving. The driver, unequivocally knowing what he had done, put his foot down on the accelerator, sped away like greased lightning, for the driver had no intention of being responsible for what he had done. Carly's heart was flapping a dime to a dozen as she finally reached her son. She dropped onto her hands and knees with an anguished expression on her face, feeling terrified of what she would find. She held her breath until her worst fears were confirmed. Oliver lay there, seemingly lifeless, like a rag doll, his helmet badly buckled, his eyes almost glazed over like a dead fish, his leg lying at an odd angle. She screamed. She knew her son was dead. There was no doubt about it in her mind. Her body trembled and shook like a blancmange jelly that could not be stilled. Her skin grew white. Her scream perforated the quiet, still street with its shrill resonance. But still, nobody realized it was a woman who was screaming. The kind of sound could cause glass to shake, windows to rattle. Then, against all the odds, Oliver, with a mischievous, naughty twinkle in his green eyes, sat up with a sudden jolt and a huge, cheeky grin on his face.
"I got you, Mummy. You should have seen your face. You thought I was dead. The other day we played dead at school and everybody said I was the most convincing dead person that they've ever seen. You thought I was dead, didn't you? You fell for it, Mummy."
"Oliver, this is not funny. You can't go riding on the street like this. You were nearly killed, and you think this is a joke. For a moment I really thought you were gone. I thought I'd lost you. How could you do this to me? Look at you. You've got grazes all over your legs and face. And if you hadn't been wearing your helmet, God forbid." She cradled her son in her arms, rocking him with the gratitude of a very grateful mother who'd been given a miracle and a second chance. The woman with her 2 pugs came dashing over towards them, her face as white as a sheet. "My God! Is your son all right? I saw the whole thing happen. It was horrific. Your son could have been killed." The woman was trembling, holding her hand on her heart. She tried to still her earnest breath. Even her pugs had abandoned their leads and dashed over to Oliver, covering him with their pink tongues. "What is wrong with people around here? Driving down a residential neighbourhood as if they think they're Nigel Mansell. They're clearly deluded. This is insane. We need speed bumps on these roads, I am telling you. I wish to God the council would do something about this. I didn't get the driver's license. I tried, but it happened so fast. But I think the driver was a teenage boy, if I'm not mistaken. Whoever he is, he needs locking up for driving like this. But this is not the first time someone has driven like that, at such an insane, unforgivable speed. Several people on this street have lost cats to ludicrously dangerous drivers. Something needs to be done about this. She stared in horror as Oliver removed his battered helmet from his head. If you hadn't been wearing that helmet, young man, I dread to think what would have happened to you. You had a lucky escape. I don't think you would be here. The woman sounded flustered as she walked away, but if she was shaken up, it was nothing on what Carly was feeling. She felt as if there was a large vacuum inside her body that could never be filled. "What on earth is the matter with you, sweetheart?" Carly's husband asked her when he returned home. He knew something was up with his wife. As she was busying herself in the kitchen with a driven determination he only ever observed in her when she was flustered or in some kind of state about something. The last time this had occurred was when her mother had died fortuitously. She was throwing pasta in a bowl of boiling water and doggedly stirring a frying pan full of tomato sauce around and around with a vicious intensity, as if her undivided attention had been demanded by the frying pan and its contents. The delicious smell of oregano, basil, tomato and garlic filtered around the kitchen, but his wife appeared to be oblivious to the fact that he had returned home, as if she hadn't even noticed his arrival. "Carly, I'm home. Are you in there?" her husband teased, knocking on her head. "You look as if you've locked up in some kind of a trance like a yogi. Something bad has happened, has it not?" he asked her. "You gave me a shock. Don't knock on my head like that. I thought... Goodness gracious, you're a nervous wreck, Carly. What on earth is the matter?" She looked at him bemused. Her face was unusually puffy and pale, and he could swear she looked as if she'd been crying. "It's you. I realise it's you, but you did give me a shock. I didn't hear you come home. I wish you had spoken a bit louder." "I don't think I could have spoken louder if I'd tried."
"How was your day at the office?" she asked, as if she wasn't really remotely interested in hearing the answer.
"Oh, you know, so-so," said Robert, shrugging his shoulders nonchalantly. "My job is hardly riveting, sweetheart. It's as predictable as the weather. Let's just say there's nothing desperately exciting about staring at beige walls day after day and being cooped up in a stuffy office."
"Well, what do you want me to do about it?" snapped Carly. "Send in a renovation team to bring colour into your workplace? Is that it?"
"Carly, what on earth is wrong with you? Why are you being so—"
He looked for the word he needed to use to describe his wife's incongruous behaviour.
"So touchy," he said. "Has someone rubbed you up the wrong way?" "It isn't about your father, is it?" he asked. "You're not worrying about him again, are you? The man is quite capable of looking after himself, I'm most sure."
With hands on her hips, Carly was staring at her husband with a strange look in her eyes that he couldn't quite discern.
"Happy now, Robert? You win."
She began to stir the tomato sauce vigorously, and the sauce was beginning to catch as the caramel smells of burn appeared to confiscate the air.
"I hope you're happy now. You win." "Sweetheart, the sauce is burning. Switch it off. Take it off the hob. What do you mean I win? What are you talking about?" "We're selling this house. We're leaving Montreal. We're moving to Banff. You can resign from your boring job in the office and we're going to buy a house in the countryside. But we're going to be productive with our lives. Even though I've got lots of money in the bank, we're not becoming my parents. Never becoming my parents. Do you understand? I can't let that happen to us under any circumstances. I cannot let money make us become lazy." "Do you think I'd ever become like your parents? Not a chance in hell, Carly. While I've always liked your parents, and I'm particularly fond of your father because he's quite the charmer, I could never sit about doing nothing for weeks on end. I'm far too industrious and inventive for that. I don't think I could ever retire for that very reason. But what brought this on? You're not making any sense. I thought you were dead set against moving to Banff. I've been begging you for years for this move, and after all this time you finally agree. What the hell has brought this on? It's not making any sense to me at all. You're usually as stubborn as a mule. When you make your mind up about something and you say no, the woman's not for turning. So what's happened to flip the pancake on the other side? I'm very intrigued. It's dangerous living here, Robert. Dangerous. We can't possibly stay here. We've got to sell this place, put it on the market, at once. Dangerous? Said her husband, letting out a laugh. You're kidding, right? There's nothing dangerous about our lovely neighbourhood. What on earth are you talking about, Carly? You're making no sense. Since I've got back home, you're all over the place. You seem desperately anxious about something. This is a very safe neighbourhood, I assure you. There hasn't been a robbery in this part of Montreal for years. What are you barking on about? I don't understand you. I'm feeling rather bewildered, if you don't mind my saying so. Carly almost growled at her husband. Oh, do I have to spell it out, Robert, all the time to you? She pointed with her finger to the front yard and the road beyond. That road out there is very dangerous. It's dangerous. We might live in a quiet neighbourhood, but I'm sorry, some of those people that drive down that road on our street are maniacs, absolute maniacs. Some of them drive at a reckless speed in a residential neighbourhood, and it's for this reason it's not safe to live here anymore. Our son was nearly killed today by a speeding car, and I was 2 days to get the number plates of that awful person that was driving at an insane speed. Oliver was very lucky not to be killed, and it sure didn't help that you removed the training wheels from his bike. How could you do that? How could you do that, Robert? He spun past me on the driveway before I had a chance to even stop him. I watched as the speeding car went colliding into our son. I witnessed his bicycle being flung up on the side of the road, buckling up into scrap metal, as the driver just sped away. Can you believe it? He sped away. What is wrong with people? If Oliver had not been wearing his helmet, I promise you, Robert, he would not be with us now. Let's just say his head would have been pulverized on that road. Luckily, he's only got grazes on his face and knees, but it could have been so much worse. We nearly lost our son today. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Robert? Do you understand why I'm so hyped up? Oh, sweetheart, I don't know what to say. That is terrifying. I can't imagine what you went through. That is the worst thing for a mother to have to see. I'm just glad I wasn't there. He was too close for comfort, Robert. Too close. It could happen again. I've been given a warning sign from God, if you like, the universe, whatever you want to call it, I don't know. We need to move. Next time we might not be so lucky, Robert. It's been a trouble in this street for years, a contentious issue. People have asked for speed bumps to be put in the road. But Mrs. Binglesby, oh, Mrs. Binglesby, always putting her nose into everybody's business. Well, she has some kind of powerful connection with the council. Well, she's put a stop to it. We've got to leave. We haven't got a choice. Robert watched his wife bursting into uncontrollable sobs. There was no comforting her. She was inconsolable with grief. His heart broke for her. He couldn't imagine how frightening it was for her to see her beloved son coming so tragically close to losing his life. It was every parent's worst nightmare. He could see that his wife was replaying the event over and over again in her head like a broken record, blaming herself for what had happened. He knew he had to take some level of responsibility for what had occurred. He regretted removing the training wheels from his son's bicycle, but he had never anticipated this happening. He thought he had got through to his son about the perils of driving on the road, but his son had not paid any attention to his sagacious advice. But to be fair, he was only 5 years old, and although he seemed as bright as a button, he was still incredibly naive, which you would expect from a kid of Oliver's age. He affectionately cradled his wife in his arms, rocking her very gently, like a baby, backwards and forwards, kissing her long chestnut brown hair. "It's going to be all right, I promise you," he told her. "All I can say is thank God our son is all right and that he was wearing his helmet. Where is he now?" "I've sedated him. I sent him to bed. He's in a terrible state, a delayed reaction, I think. Even in his young age, he knows he came close to losing his life. At first, it was just a big joke to him. He even pretended to be dead when he was lying on the road. But I think it's finally got through to him that this is no laughing matter, when he realized that if he hadn't been wearing that helmet of his, he might not be here, and I think that came as quite a shock to him, and a big wake-up call. He's also upset his bike is completely ruined, and he's asking for another." "Well, I think we shan't be getting him another quite so quickly. We'll have to think about that. But I agree with you. Some drivers are treacherous on this street. But we don't have to move to Banff, you know. There are other quieter neighbourhoods in Montreal, where people walk their dogs and cars are not nearly as aggressive as they are here. We could move somewhere like that if you like, onto a street with traffic bumps in the middle of the road. Or we can bring our son's near escape from death to the attention of the council, for our borough, that is. Maybe they will finally listen to us for a change before they have a death on their hands. The speeding on this stretch of road is ludicrous. I've seen it myself." "Not a chance, sweetheart. I'm sorry. I've made up our minds. We're not staying here. We're moving to Banff, and you must give in your notice at work as soon as possible. We're going to be entrepreneurs in our new life. At least it will sort out the problem with my father." "What do you mean, the problem?" "Well, ever since Mum died, things have gone from bad to worse. Dad is so miserable these days without Mum. He's just sinking into a deep, lugubrious depression. I hasten to say the house is looking as bedraggled as it did when I was growing up as a girl. And the inside of the house is disordered and chaotic. It looks as if it's been hit by a tornado. I think when we move to Banff, he should move in with us. I can get his house fixed up for him and put on the market. I was hoping you could encourage him to see that there is life beyond a sofa and a television set and all the books he reads, and give him something to live for. Otherwise he's quite literally going to waste away, curl up and die, and I couldn't bear to see that happen to him. I heard it happens to geese, you know. They stay together for life and are devoted to each other, and when one dies the other follows close behind. That's what a broken heart does to you. I remember Mr. Miller had 2 geese. That's exactly what happened to the male after the female died. A week later he found his healthy male goose dead. He said the male goose was so broken up about the female's demise. The poor thing was never the same again after his partner died. Dad is so much the same as that. He has a broken heart about losing my mother. And being lazy by nature doesn't do him any favours. It's only accelerating the chances of him either getting seriously sick or exiting this planet far too soon. I really don't want to lose my dad. The thought is just too dreadful. You're an influencer and shaker, Robert. You can show my father that even though Mum's gone, he does have something to live for. One thing about Banff, well, it's exquisite. There's the turquoise lakes like Lake Louise, prepossessing scenery that will steal your breath away. If you're miserable in a place like that is literally heaven on earth, then you've seriously got problems. I'm sure a place like that would be so good for my father." "You really think that this is a good idea? Your father moving in with us, I mean." "Well, it's either that, Robert, or much like my mother, he's going to an early grave. He's still not drinking any beer at all. And ever since Mum died, he's eaten practically nothing. He's wasting away. He's got so slender. My mother only died young because she ate herself to death consuming enough sugar to sink the Titanic. But it's not too late for my father. We can help him recover from his lugubrious melancholia and his grief. Besides, it's good for my dad to be around his grandson. He was always such a great reader. He's a wise, learned old soul. He can teach Oliver so much. Put it this way, I don't think my father would have been so quick to remove the training wheels from Oliver's bike, like you did. I think he'd have known better. On the subject of Oliver, we'll have to get him a brand new bike.
or we ain't going to hear the end of it. Despite his close call with death, he still wants another bike. That's resilience, believe me."
"You say that, sweetheart, because the real truth is you know your father would be far too lazy to remove those training wheels," said Robert, giving his wife a grin. "Am I right, or am I right?" "Oh, right. I admit you have a point. Are we going to Banff or not? Is it agreed?"
Robert grinned at Carly with a smile so wide that his lips almost looked lopsided on one side of his face.
"You want to bet? I've always wanted to live in Banff. Do I look like I would look a gift horse in the mouth? You're the one who wanted to stay here in Montreal. Not me, I might add. I was the one that said I wanted to live a life surrounded by exquisite scenery. But you were scared I would become like your father, doing nothing. But that's not me. Money will never change me. It's a useful tool, and that's about it. I have no interest in fancy exotic trips to the Mediterranean, exclusive spa treatments, luxurious hotels. I'm a practical guy. A little luxury now and then is nice, but that's about it. I like simplicity most of the time, and I'm certainly not a jet-setter. Travelling the world, you know, is not it's all cracked up to be. It's far too overrated, in my opinion."
"I know it is, isn't it, Robert? But I do remember watching this programme once. The family made all their money from Johnson & Johnson. They were stinking rich. The father pottered around his house all day, painting pictures on an easel. The self-entitled son was so spoilt, so full of himself. It truly looked as if clover was growing out of his nostrils and ears. They had it all, but you know what? They had absolutely nothing. It was almost pitiful. It was like all the ambition that they could have procured in this lifetime to make something of their lives was gone because they didn't need to do it. And then you hear of people who come from poverty, who bust their guts to achieve their goals. And they're so accomplished and so fulfilled. So you see, Robert, sometimes inheriting wealth, when you have an aptitude for laziness like my father and mother did, is more than a curse than a blessing. My father's father knew that. He was right."
"I get where you're going with this, Carly, but I keep telling you that is not us. I still want to work in Banff, giving something back to the world, to the community. Your finances give us the freedom to do something that I love. That will make a difference. It's not about being lazy. Far from it, in fact. Your fears are unfounded. Our financial freedom will just give us choices, and that's all."
Carly looked up to see her son Oliver standing in the kitchen. He was carrying his big blue octopus in his hands and looking at them with wide eyes.
"Mummy, my knee really hurts me."
"Of course it hurts, sweetheart. You grazed yourself badly today."
"If you read me a story, it might feel better, and some warm milk and cookies would be nice, and then my knee, it'll heal very fast. I know it will." "Hello, sport. Are you going to give your father a hug? I understand you had a bit of an accident today." "Dad, I went flying off my bike onto the sidewalk. I pretended to be dead. You should have seen Mummy's face. She was crying really badly. Then I felt bad because I gave her a scare. The lady from the street, she's got 2 black dogs with flat faces. She said the whole accident, the man that was driving the car, he didn't stop. The lady said he should be locked up into prison forever and ever, but they didn't get his number plates. She had clever doggies, Daddy, because they knew I'd been hurt. They were licking my knee better and my face. The lady said that my helmet that I wear on my head, that it definitely saved my life. I'm sorry, Daddy, but I didn't mean to cycle fast, but the bicycle wasn't slow without the training wheels."
"I'm sorry, sport. I should never have taken the training wheels off your bicycle, should I? But when it comes to your mother, it wasn't a nice thing to do, pretending to be dead. You gave your mother a big fright. You scared her half to death. And the truth is, you could have been killed today. You must never ride your bicycle on that road again, without being supervised.
Do you understand?
But I can't anyway, Daddy. The main man in the car, the one that ran me over or knocked over my bike, he drove into it. He destroyed my bike, Daddy, and now my bike is dead. The bicycle chain came off and the bicycle is all bent up.
Well, be glad that it was the bicycle that got harmed, and not you. I'm sure he didn't drive into you on purpose, Sport, but he was driving way too fast. He was being irresponsible. He probably did not see you on the road, which is why it's best you don't cycle down a dangerous road like that. It may look very peaceful and tranquil, there may not be very much traffic around, but it just takes one car to come driving down that road very fast, not looking where it's going, and trouble ensues. As I keep telling you, you need to be careful.
Robert knew if it wasn't for his 5-year-old son Oliver's serendipitous near-fatal run-in with that car, and the close call he had with death, moving to Banff would not be on the cards for their family, by any manner of means. Indeed, his wife Carly had insisted that they could think about such moves when they were of retirement age, but not now. It was almost like one domino came crashing down, and the others followed in sequence. And this turn of events was in no way negative, but he never expected it would be his 5-year-old son that would facilitate the family move to Pastures Green, by putting the fear of God into his wife, who believed the fortuitous accident was some kind of a sign from the gods warning them to leave Montreal, when in reality this accident could have happened in any neighbourhood, in any part of the world. Robert thought about the quirky woman at work, who was considered a bit of an oddball in the office. But for him she was like a breath of fresh air. She was individualistic, nonconformist, rather eccentric. She had Romany origins and considered herself a gypsy, and was proud of her roots. She wore headscarves on her head every day, long bright skirts, crochet shawls, hundreds of gold bracelets and necklaces. She had nut-brown skin, long dark shiny hair, and very intense brown eyes that you could swear could look right through you like a voucher. She was very intimidating for a lot of people in the office, who found her stares quite uncomfortable. The woman claimed to read palms, tea leaves, and the tarot, and one day she caused quite a stir in the office, when she actually brought a crystal ball along to work. People in the office preferred to ignore her, and only gave her attention when her predictions started to come true. She told one lady in the office who was spending a fortune on IVF treatments to fall pregnant not to bother, because she'd have a baby naturally the following year, and it would be a boy. So she didn't need to engage in any fertility treatments, and sure enough that's exactly what happened. So in a moment of boredom, Robert asked her if she saw anything in his tarot cards, and was amazed when she told him she saw him moving away. "I wish," he had grimaced to her, looking at her wistfully. "I'm afraid it's not going to happen," he insisted. "It's not from want of trying, but the lady's not for changing her mind. My wife is mulishly stubborn about such things." Janice lifted up the tower card and showed it to Robert. He squirmed at the sight of such a horrifying card. He saw a tall tower, with people flying out of it, that made him think of the Twin Towers tragedy in New York. Then this was followed by the death card that wasn't good. It looked very ominous. She had laughed. "Don't get anxious, Robert. It's nothing bad. The cards just say your life, as you know it, is going to come tumbling down like the tower here. The death card means the birth of a brand new beginning, the end of an old cycle. I think you must be moving away from your life here in Montreal, going somewhere different, where you're going to be much happier than you are now. I see your dreams being fulfilled. You have the 10 of Pentacles here, followed by the Sun card. It's looking good for you, Robert. Very good." Robert was rather encouraged by the reading with Janice, but he suspected it was all stuff and nonsense, really, not to be taken seriously. So what if she'd been accurate in her predictions about Sally Roper's baby and Robert Morrison's marriage when the man hadn't even started dating his betrothed at the time? Besides, did he really believe in the tarot? No, of course not. But it was nice to dream. All he could think of now was moving to Banff. He adored that part of the world,
and the moment he first laid eyes on Lake Louise, he knew he wanted to live in this part of the world more than anything else. The water in that lake had been turquoise, and he'd never seen anything more prepossessing in his entire life. He left the office that day with a significant spring in his step, thinking about Janice's predictions for his future. Could he dare to hope that his family would one day move to Banff? It seemed like such an unattainable pipe dream. He thought he'd slipped into an alternative universe when he arrived home to find his wife wanted to move to Banff. What were the chances of that? He'd never envisaged it happening in all the months of Sundays put together. God never normally heard his prayers when he'd begged him about the matter for the last 5 years or so. Now it was happening, and it seemed so surreal, far too surreal to digest, as if he was sure he'd been dreaming. But no, it really was happening against all the odds. The family, his family, was moving to Banff. Furthermore, it was his wife that was insistent about the move, not him, almost as if a veil had been lifted from her eyes, and she was seeing their lives through a completely different lens. It wouldn't be so great having Carly's father moving in with them. A bit of an imposition, perhaps. But to give him his due, he was an eccentric man with a great sense of humour. If Carly's father, Chuck, had his way, he'd probably just curl up and die. He'd been hopelessly in love with his wife when she was alive, and finally when she was gone, it would seem something inside him broke. Carly was right. If her father did not move in with them, he probably would die in the next 6 months or so, of a broken heart. He was failing to take better care of himself. If having the father-in-law moving in with them to their brand new home in Banff was what was on the cards, it certainly was a small price to pay, to wake up to those prepossessing views every day of the week. Maybe he'd get involved in the tourist industry, offering people hiking expeditions in the countryside. He'd think about it. He knew that Carly was terrified that with her hefty bank balance that she and Robert would follow in her parents' footsteps and become lazy slobs. But that would never happen. They weren't naturally lazy as a couple, and they loved to embrace an adventurous lifestyle, and doing nothing was not in their DNA. Robert had loathed his job at the office, working for a drudgerous accounting company that was privately owned in Montreal, and spending his days behind a computer, staring at the bleak, oppressive, joyless white wall, along with an old calendar that had not been removed for over 5 years, thanks to 50-year-old Doreen Douglas. She had hung the hunky fireman's calendar on the wall, and loved to look at it every day of the week. It displayed 12 beefy, rather brawny-looking firemen, wearing no shirts and sitting on the backs of Harley-Davidsons or standing on the fire truck, in very suggestive poses with their bulking pecs. They were strapping, muscular, shredded men for every single month of the year, and she was in love with Mr. April, so the calendar remained rigidly fixed on April, despite the fact that it was years out of date. And maybe Mr. April didn't look like that anymore. But try telling that to Doreen Douglas, who had been having an affair with Mr. April for 5 successive years. Only it was a love affair in her head, and she would stare at that calendar as if Mr. April was her long-lost love. Robert wished to God it wasn't on his wall next to his desk, but Doris didn't have a wall, so had borrowed his wall space, so she could view her fireman from the opposite side of the desk, where her computer was set up. Recently a new recruit whom arrived at the office, who was gay, had been given Robert the approving eye, and flirting outrageously with him. "I won't tell your wife if you don't," he had whispered to Robert in his ear. "I've been with many married men before. I'm very discreet, you know. Mum's the word. I find you very attractive, Robert. I don't believe in keeping my feelings contained. I wear my heart on my sleeve, you know. Just so you know, for the record, you've got excellent taste in men," he said, giving him a wink. "And by the way, just between you and me, I have a very similar tattoo on my derriere that you would love." "Sorry, what are you talking about?" Robert had asked. "I'm not gay. I'm happily married." The young man had tapped his nose as if to say he knew different. "You're very shy, Robert. How very sweet. I like it when my men are shy. Why are you acting so coy? There really is no need to be embarrassed, he said, pointing to the calendar with a huge grin on his face. Oh, that, said Robert. I might have known. That's not mine. It belongs to Doris over there. It's not my calendar. She's the one interested in the fireman with the big pecs and the cryptic tattoos. I'm not into that kind of thing. I like women. The new recruit looked disappointed. Life's a bitch. Why do the best men have to be taken? Why do they have to not be gay? It's so not fair. Story of my life. I thought I was on to a winner with you, Robert. Sorry, no can do, said Robert.
The mood in that office, day in and day out, was depressing, and everyone couldn't wait for the dials on the clock to finally turn to the 5 o'clock marking. But that sometimes took an agonizing long time to happen. Then, like a flock of geese, everyone flew out of that office so fast. They were longing to return to their roosting places and cosy homes, gladdened that the drudgerous day was finally behind them. In truth, no one enjoyed working in that stuffy office, doing the same things day in and day out, like hamsters going around and around on a wheel. It was a dead-end job from which Robert and his business colleagues derived very little satisfaction, as all the challenging decisions in the job were made by the senior executives in the company. It was an unfair environment, where nepotism reigned supreme, so any promotions were kept strictly within the family. Even if the person in question was not qualified for the job, if they were associated with the Riley family, in one way or another they were crowned with a position of privilege and honour, even if they were completely incompetent. It had naturally meant anyone with the company with any aspiring ambitions had no chance of being promoted, unless they had a special connection with the Riley family, so people were naturally forever discouraged. Robert and his wife were financially free, which really was a blessing. Carly's father had given his wife and her brother a hefty chunk of their inheritance while he was alive, to save inheritance taxes, which was a clever thing to do. Robert had tried to persuade his wife Carly that with their financial freedom they could live anywhere in the world they wanted to. He had always dreamed of living in Banff, which was as picturesque as the views you'll see on a box of Swiss chocolates. But his wife had been against the idea, because of the fear of becoming like her parents and never doing a damn thing. It was a very real fear of his wife's, rooted from a childhood where she'd lived in a house that almost looked abandoned and derelict, because both of her parents had been too lazy to concern themselves with its general maintenance and upkeep. They just didn't bother, his wife had told him. It was so humiliating for us, because our house was the eyesore in the street, with knee-high grass, warped shutters, and me and my brother Larry felt very self-conscious about that. Don't get me wrong, my parents were wonderful people, but let's just say their lackadaisical approach towards life left much to be desired. 1 year later, Robert's account. Moving to Banff was the best decision my family could have ever made, and I knew what an immense privilege it was for us to live in such a prepossessing, idyllic part of the world. And its magic had even transformed my father-in-law Chuck from a broken man who had lost his will to live to someone who woke up with a spring in his step and a purpose in his heart every single day. He thoroughly enjoyed taking a stroll out of doors, which was something he hadn't done for over 50 long years. It was wonderful for Oliver to have his grandfather around, and the man could make you laugh so much that your belly would ache. He was a well-learned man who knew much about many things, and had taken on to helping Oliver read very eloquently for one so young. We moved to an exclusive neighbourhood called Breer, a stone's throw away from Whistler's village, referred to as the Sunridge Plateau. We moved into a sizable house with 6 bedrooms and 6 bathrooms that was perched on a 2,000-square-foot lot. The house boasted 18-foot ceilings, with salt stone walls that contained wood-burning and gas-assisted fireplaces, which people tend to like a great deal in Whistler, as it regulates the temperature, I'm told. When my wife's father moved in, I genuinely thought that the man was too set in his ways, and that it would take a herd of gallivanting bison to uproot him from the sofa, where he'd be seated for the lion's share of the day, watching television or reading books by a cosy fire. When he first agreed to move in, He was very reluctant and worried he'd be imposing on us, but we assured him that we would like him very much to live with us. In the beginning I thought we'd made a grievous mistake, inviting Chuck to move in, as my wife's father did nothing all day but fall asleep by the couch, barely moving a muscle. It was obvious that this man had become a shadow of his former self, but one day that all changed. It all began one unassuming day, when you least expect something strange to occur, and then it invariably does. Me and my wife and our son Oliver were out shopping in Whistler. My father-in-law was sitting comfortably by a fire reading a book. Then he heard a scratching sound at the door. It was very strange, so he quickly went to open it to see what was going on. He discovered a beautiful white dog, resembling a wolf, standing at the door, with a desperate, pleading look in his sad, dark eyes. The dog looked emaciated and thin. He sensed it was asking him for help, as if personally seeking him out. He thought such a fabulous dog had to belong to someone. But seeing the skeletal bones sticking out of the dog's skin so pointedly, like gnarled ropes, it was clear the animal was half-starved. He was grievously concerned about the dog's welfare, so he brought the dog into the house to lie by the crackling fire, and to eat a plate of human food. And that dog ate and ate as if his life depended on it. My father-in-law made some inquiries to find out if anyone was missing this dog, but no one came forward to claim her, and he secretly hoped they wouldn't. He said from the moment he laid eyes on Snow White, he knew that they were like-minded souls going through great anguish together, and in each other they saw a kindred spirit. Chuck did not want to let the dog freeze to death, so he brought her into the house, not caring how we would react to this furry friend. But no one was more delighted than my son Oliver, who thought the dog was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen.
She looks like the snow, so white. Her eyes are dark, like the ink in my pen. I really like her, Pops. She's the best dog that I've ever seen in my life, and she looks so clever.
That's because she is clever, Sport. Why do you think she came to the door to ask for help? That's because she is clever.
Exactly, that's what I say. I knew she was clever.
My father-in-law became incredibly attached to his female companion that he chose to call Snow White, because of her white resplendent coat that grew more and more magnificent every day, and also because she came from the brink of death, rather like the character in the fairy tale, after eating the poison apple. She really was magnificent, and looked more like a wolf than a dog. My wife believed Snow White was an angel in dog's clothes, as no one claimed her, despite there even being an announcement about her on the local radio. She appeared out of the blue from nowhere, and she completely delivered my father-in-law from his lugubrious melancholia, as if a dark cloud had been lifted off his life, and in its place a rainbow had arrived. The man who in the past could not be persuaded to walk from the living room to the kitchen unless there was a reward of dinner being served, was now determined to take responsibility for Snow White, who was dependent on him for exercise. So began my father-in-law's regular trips in his white Range Rover to a very stunning location outside Banff, where you can walk up this mountainous elevation on a prepossessing trail, which I gather is very secret. Not many people know about it. Surrounded by exquisite scenic vistas, and it appears to be dog-friendly. This eccentric man, who could barely move a muscle, because it was too much like hard work, became fitter and more nimble on his feet, all because he wanted to make Snow White happy, and to give her the life she deserved. Such was his devotion and loyalty to Snow White, which was reciprocated 100-fold, for the dog never left his side. It was extraordinary how the heaviness that had formerly swallowed up his joy like a whale had been lifted off him, and he no longer wallowed in his grief and despair, for he had something else to think about beyond his late wife. It would seem Snow White had given him a purpose for living. This gorgeous-looking Arctic wolf-like creature had reached out to Chuck for help, and it was as if he almost forgot about his own dreadful loss by helping out the distressed dog, who needed him, and in alleviating her pain, he'd managed to extinguish his own. In no time at all, Snow White picked up weight,
becoming a devoted, loving member of our household, who attached herself to my father-in-law like a barnacle on a rock. It was difficult to tear the two apart, even with the temptation of a stunning steak on offer or a ball being thrown in the basement by Oliver. She was not interested unless it was Chuck presenting her with the steak, or Chuck throwing the ball. I hasten to say that dog loved the bones of Chuck, and knew unequivocally he'd saved her life. So in her eyes, Chuck was her quintessential hero. I hasten to say when someone has a will to live, their health improves exponentially. Chuck's pasty face had become flushed with pink. His eyes, once almost deadened by grief, sparkled with renewed hope. And one day he even agreed to go to the barber's to have his hair cut, and my father-in-law looked decidedly more handsome after that pruning, which involved an old-fashioned close-cut shave, where his long white sideburns that the hairstylist told him had gone out of fashion a long time ago were finally removed. My wife took her dad to McCool's, which is a one-stop shop for all your outdoor gear in Whistler's, and he was kitted out with nifty attire and very robust walking boots, so that he could take Snow White for plenty of outdoor exercise, wearing the right type of gear. In the evening, Snow White would lie across Chuck's legs while he was reading, like a long, furry foot-warmer, and soon became an invaluable member of our family, loved by us all very dearly. He was also a comedian, much like my father, making us laugh all the time, as if by hanging around Chuck, he'd also picked up some of his quirky characteristics. When she was hungry, she'd pick up her food bowl in her mouth and drop it on my father-in-law's lap. She would sit there on her haunches, her dark eyes fixed on him, patting him on the knee with her paw. My father-in-law would pretend not to notice, so she'd lift the food bowl off his lap and throw it on his feet to get his attention. Once again she would pat his knee with her paw, as if to say, "Go on, don't be so lazy. Are you going to feed me or not?" My father-in-law would throw down his book and say, all right, Snow White, food is on its way." And he would trudge over to the kitchen to fill up Snow White's bowl with pellets. And once she'd gobbled it all up, she'd pat him with her paw again to say thank you. The bond between man and dog took my breath away. It was beautiful to watch. I'd never seen such devotion before. My father-in-law became friendly with all the locals in town, who loved him and his quirky sense of humour. In Whistler he was known as the debonair man with the white hair, who went everywhere with his white dog. It was easy for my father-in-law to gain that debonair reputation, after, of course, shedding all that walrus-like blubber from the past. I had built some asphalt bicycle paths on our property, so that my son Oliver could cycle around to his heart's content, without worrying about any oncoming traffic, and the relief that this little exercise brought my wife was immeasurable. She believed our move to Banff was serendipitously preordained, and that the universe had given us one warning to move after my son had experienced that fortuitous accident on his bike. "I don't know, Robert," she told me, "but there was a distinctive voice in my head that said if you don't leave Montreal, then the next time this happens, your son might be killed." I knew the voice was right, as our son is so obstinate, at the very best of times, and impulsively makes decisions that later on he regrets. And I knew the same accident could happen again, but this time our Oliver would never escape with his life. Twice lucky, I don't think so. I had to pay attention to that inner voice, which is why we came here. My wife would walk to the ends of the earth if it meant saving her son's life. She told me her mother had always taught her to listen to that intuitive nudge, because it was always important and should never be ignored. She told her daughter that the day she left Sylvia the cat out in the snow overnight, a voice in her head told her to leave the window open a little, but she thought that was crazy, and Sylvia nearly froze to death as a result. If her mother had left the kitchen window slightly ajar, Sylvia would have got into the house easily, and not moved to the old lady's house next door, as the idea of being left out in the snow again was not acceptable for the poor cat. For me personally, I was very happy to be enjoying a brand new life in Banff, and certainly did not miss my old job in Montreal, nor the hunky old calendar of the firemen staring at me from 9 to 5 every day. There were far more attractive things for my eyes to be feasting on, and the scenery in Banff was certainly one of those things. I had already taken tourists on hiking trails with great success, and my wife's fear of my becoming a redundant layabout amounted to nothing. Soon I was encouraging my father-in-law to regularly come fishing with me, to go here, to go there, and he was becoming alive, rather like a strangled orchid whose roots has been stuffed in a tight container for a very long period of time, suddenly being released and being able to breathe again. Once those dying, distressed roots are loosened from their tangled confinement. It was miraculous to observe the dramatic but beautiful transformations in my father-in-law, which no one welcomed more than my wife. "Did I not tell you, or did I not tell you, it would be great if my dad moved in with us? He's such a lovable teddy bear, isn't he? Our household has become so complete, and Oliver simply adores his grandfather, who reads to him, tells him stories all the time. And what little boy doesn't adore a big white fluffy dog to cuddle up to? I believe if my father had not moved in with us, he'd be deceased by now. I don't just think it, I know it. These days he's balanced his excessive reading with physical exercise. He's no longer on high blood pressure medication, and looks better and younger than he's done so in years. I don't think he would be here, and I mean that, Robert, if he hadn't moved in with us. And I believe our sacrifice has turned out to be our biggest blessing. I've never felt so close to my father as I do now. It seems so natural to be living together 3 generations in one family. I think I'm beginning to understand, Robert, why some Mediterranean families live together. Grandparents and grandchildren alike. It actually works. When I listen to my father talking to our son, giving him such wizened advice from such an old soul, I can see our son is more mature than most in his year. My father has taught him so much. That's why the elders in some cultures are highly esteemed for their sagacious wisdom, you know. Do you know his teacher says he's so advanced for his year, and I think he has his grandpa Chuck to thank for that. One day, little did I know that this day would not follow the usual trajectory of all the previous days, and that something rather peculiar was about to transpire. When a fortuitous event you don't see coming arrives on the scene, no one is prepared for it. It's a little like planning a party, and never for a moment had you anticipated rain, but the rain comes, and it throws all your plans out of the window like an apple core on the side of the road. The day had started much like any other, and that was the way I thought it would end, with the usual family routines coming into play. But that is not what happened. It was autumn, and a particularly beautiful time of year in Banff, for some of the trees were bedecked with a confetti of gold, red or amber leaves, and against the blue sky and the green rolling countryside, it was a feast for the eyes. It was in the late afternoon that my father-in-law Chuck Fournier decided he'd take Snow White for a walk at their favourite spot. "I've been a bit lazy today," he told me. "The novel I was reading, well, it was so gripping. I simply couldn't put it down. But Snow White has been very patient with me all day, and we both need some fresh air and exercise." "Look at the time, Chuck," I said gingerly. "Are you sure that this is a good idea? I don't mean to put a spanner in the works, but it's nippy outdoors now. It's getting dark early. You don't want to find yourself getting caught up on a hiking trail at this time, especially if it gets dark. Look, Robert, you're sounding exactly like my daughter. Will you relax? I'm not going to be long. We're just going on the hiking trail that I always take every day. Snow White loves it there. I'm not going to deprive her of that. We just won't be gone for as long as I usually am, but we'll be back before it gets dark. I'm quite sure, Chuck, that Snow White here will forgive you if she misses out on just one walk. I personally think it's ridiculous to venture out now. I'm sure all the locals in Whistler would agree with me and advise you not to walk so late in the day, especially in autumn when it gets dark quickly. My strong-willed father-in-law was as wilfully obstinate and headstrong as my wife. I knew there was no arguing with him, as the stubborn, obdurate streak in the Fournier family line had been inherited by my son Oliver. I knew all about dealing with intractable, doggedly inflexible people who are resolutely bull-headed about something. If you try to persuade them any different and ask them to listen to you, they'll become contrary and even more iron-willed and unbending. I decided to let my father-in-law make his own decisions for himself. I could not dictate his life choices. It wasn't my place to do so. I watched him put on his puffer jacket, his scarf around his neck, and his walking boots on his feet. He gave me a nod and said, "See you soon, Robert. As I told you, I won't be gone for terribly long." Then Snow White, with her tail wagging happily, bounded after him, letting out a couple of delighted woofs and giving me a look as if to say, "My master would never ever let me down, not like you. I'm going for walkies." I watched the white dog diving into the passenger side seat of Chuck's Range Rover, and they drove away. I'm not a superstitious person, served with an intuitive mindset like my wife is, but I will say this. Something did not feel right about my father-in-law leaving for a walk at this late time of the afternoon. It left me with chills running down my spine and an unsavoury bitter taste polluting the back of my throat. But there was not a damn thing I could do about it. It was a pity my wife was in Banff, having attended a pizza party with Oliver and friends. If she had been home, she'd have persuaded her father not to go out for this walk, because one stubborn person talking to another is far more effective than anything else I know. It's as if they know how to break down the barriers of this unyielding war of willfulness that is so typical of my father-in-law. Why did I have an overwhelming feeling that he would get himself into trouble? I wished to God the feeling would leave me, but it clung to me like sticky chewing gum that you cannot easily remove, leaving me feeling decidedly apprehensive. I was soon to learn that I had a lot to be apprehensive about. Chuck's account. When my wife died, I really thought my life was over. I stopped eating. I no longer drowned my sorrows in cans of beer, as you might expect I would. I had reached the startling revelation that I had nothing left to live for. I was quite happy to die, and I reached a peace about it. I didn't want to go on with my life if it meant living without her, and I'm sure many men who've lost their wives in similar circumstances understand where I'm coming from. When my daughter began to insist that I move to Banff and live in the home they purchased, I thought it was a very bad idea. I certainly did not want to impose on my daughter's kindness, and nor did I want to live any more, although I did not wish to share this sorry information with her, as that would have made her very sad. That was the way I felt. Moving in with them would mean I'd have to make some kind of an effort to do my part in reading to my grandson Oliver and helping my daughter around the house. I didn't want any of that. I just wanted to curl up and die. I was happy with that choice. Without my wife, without her cute smiling face, the big dimples and lively personality, what did I have to live for? Nothing. I just wanted to fade away like the summer flowers at the end of the season. I was ready for that, and had no fear of death. As like the perennial flowers, I knew I would be back, with a much more nimble body next time, and hopefully my wife would be in the picture again. I had been a very well-read man all my life, and I'm afraid I lived a very sedentary lifestyle, doing the bare minimum with my wife, who shared in my lazy tendencies. But we were like two happy Teletubbies, enjoying the sanctuary of our home together, which in the early years of my children's life, I'm ashamed to confess, was the most derelict house in the neighbourhood due to my neglect and my inability to leave a good novel behind to attend to some grass that decided to grow offensively long. On the outside, our home looked a sorry bedraggled sight in our neighbourhood, but on the inside it was a cosy den that could get a little untidy at times, as I was useless with housework, and I wouldn't be the remotest bit offended, but there you go. It distressed me that my obsession with reading and watching sport on the box, along with drinking so many beers, had done this to both of my kids. My father told me on his deathbed that he didn't want to leave me his vast fortune, as I was predisposed to being lackadaisical, and he was right about that. All my father's money meant was that I had the freedom to do what I liked, which was so liberating, but probably not in a good way, I could hibernate in my home like a very contented black bear. Do I regret it? Not really, as strange as that may sound. I lived my life very contentedly through my books. I also thoroughly enjoyed my interactions with my beloved wife and children, who made me smile all the time, and I thoroughly enjoyed the company of friends. You can live a very fulfilled life from your sofa if you keep yourself mentally stimulated. But my body was retaliating from my couch potato lifestyle, and my doctor had told me as much. "If you don't move a little more, Mr. Fournier, you will be joining your wife in an early grave." My blood pressure was through the roof, and even the medications I was taking would only adjust the blood pressure readings by a small amount. They were still insanely high. At the time I was overweight, with a stomach that hung over my pants that was so large it seriously looked as if I was about to give birth to triplets. But after my wife died, I shed the weight effortlessly easily, along with the beer gut, as my desire to eat had died with my wife. When I moved into the mansion in Whistler, with my daughter, her husband, and Oliver, I was almost certainly arrested by the spectacular views that stirred up my dying, defeated spirit, making me realize that there really was life beyond my wife's death. But I was still in that very dark, foreboding, depressing place. But that was all about to change, in a fortuitous way I never envisaged possible, with a serendipitous event that I believe shook me out of my lugubrious melancholia. And it helped me to stop feeling so dreadfully sorry for myself. One day when my daughter, her husband, and my grandson Oliver had been invited to dinner with one local in Whistler, I had rejected the invite. I still wasn't in a good place, and needed some time to myself. I was sitting by a warm fireplace in the living room, and I heard the scratching sound while I was reading a novel, even though the fire in the grate was crackling and spitting away heartily. The scratching sound was isolated and very distinctive. It got my attention at once. I stopped reading and listened attentively. The scratching continued, and it was accompanied by a whining sound. "What the hell?" I thought. "What on earth is making that sound?" It was beginning to annoy me ever so slightly, so I plonked my book down on the coffee table, with a bookmark to secure the place. I rose out of the couch and followed the sound down the passage to the front door. I opened it curiously, and outside the front door was a dog, who looked much more sorrowful than I did, and my heart reached out to her. She was magnificently beautiful, but so emaciated, with her ribs jutting out of her coat like wiry coat hangers, and her white hair was matted and dull. Those black eyes stared at me pleadingly, and I knew this dog was reaching out to me for help. How could I possibly turn her away? I wanted to save her more than anything else in the world. I wanted to help her get flesh on her bones, and give her a warm, comfortable place to sleep. In that moment my attention was diverted away from my miserable self towards something else worthy of my attention, that clearly needed my help, and an unlikely bond was born between the both of us that I never saw coming. In that moment I was like a candle wick that had been smouldering as it started to die out, but now the flame on the wick had been reignited. When your life has no purpose, you're as good as dead, but when you find a reason to live, then you want to thrive, and the idea of dying loses its appeal very fast. I decided to call my dog Snow White, because Snow White nearly died of eating a poison apple in the fairy tale, and in my dog's case the poison was her impoverishment, her starvation, her inability to find somewhere warm to sleep. But in finding our home, in finding me, she was delivered from her deadly plight, like when the prince found Snow White and kissed her back to life again. I hasten to say, when no one claimed Snow White, I did ponder where on earth she'd come from. But this dog saved my life, more than I actually saved hers. But together we were kindred spirits that could relate to each other's pain. It was on an autumn afternoon. I got very involved in a novel I was reading, not so much for the content, but simply because it was so well written. It had me on the edge of my chair, and was significantly hard to put down. These days not many novels had that kind of power over me, but this one had me hooked. I had to find out who the murderer was, although I almost certainly knew. I had my sneaky suspicions it was a woman called Abby,
who had been giving her victim the evil eye for many long years, and wanted to kill him, for she had a secret interest in the man's wife, and wanted him well out of the way. But tragically for her, the man's wife had no affection for Ebby, and was not that way inclined. The clock began ticking away, and Snow White, who was lying across my feet, kept glancing up at me in anticipation, with that hopeful, eager look in her dark eyes. "Are we going for a walk or not?" I had fortunately become very fit since Snow White had entered my life. I had discovered a prepossessing hiking trail on a slight mountainous incline, where you walked through a wood grove until you got to the top of this mountain, and you could look down on the valley below, over exquisite views onto a turquoise lake, almost as enchanting as Lake Louise, but a whole lot smaller, of course. One of the locals in Whistler confided in me about this hiking trail, swearing me to secrecy. "Don't tell anyone about it," he told me. "I don't want tourists to find out about this place. It's our little secret," he said, tapping his nose. I have no idea why he had confided in me about this location, but I had taken my son-in-law on the trail, and he agreed it was absolutely incredible. There are no words to describe its ambience, its serenity, and sheer beauty. It was such a tranquil paradise that was simply postcard perfect. So I won't even bother to try and tell you how bewitching it was, for words fail to epitomize its sheer magnificence. And certainly during the autumn months, so many of the trees were richly bedecked in resplendent garlands of gold and red leaves, and it was absolutely breathtaking. Snow White, with her spirited energy and rambunctious enthusiasm, thoroughly enjoyed venturing up this mountainous trail, appearing to love it as much as I did, as there was always new scent signatures for her to explore. I climbed out of the upholstered chair with a measure of reluctance. The fire was crackling away merrily in the grate. It was rather difficult to squirrel myself away from such luxurious comfort, especially when it was so warm and cosy inside the house. But with Snow White eager to go for a walk, how could I refuse her? How could I let her down? My son-in-law Robert was at the desk in the lounge, making some notes. He looked up at me with a frown developing between his brows, when he heard me call out to Snow White, "Are you coming, girl? We're going for a walk. Coming?" "Where are you going, Chuck?" he asked me. "It's nippy out there. It'll be dark soon. Why would you take Snow White out now? Let her go for a run in the yard, but you don't need to go walking with her." "Oh, but I do," I told Robert. "I won't be long. I remember reading somewhere that even if you take a dog for a 10-minute stroll, as opposed to half an hour, they won't even know the difference, but they'll feel as if they've gone out." I knew, of course, my son-in-law was right, but I never liked to give him the credit when it was due. Instead, I liked to be obstinate. It seems to be a natural instinct of mine. It would get dark soon. The weather was chilly, but I would be quick, and try as he might to discourage me, he couldn't persuade me to change my mind. Soon I was in my white Ranger, with Snow White sitting opposite me, with her long nose smudging the passenger side window as she peered out at the landscape. Before long we arrived at the parking area outside the trail, which was empty, as no one knows about this marvellous place, even hardened locals who have lived in Whistler for many long years. So I was privileged to bring my dog here. The moment I parked the car, Snow White began to wag her tail furiously and let out a couple of excited woofs. I opened the door for her, and she bolted past me. Moments later we were ambling at an increased speed down the earthen trail, where on every side we were surrounded by tall, lofty trees, some elegantly swathed in exquisite leafy overcoats of gold, red, and amber. My walking boots were beating briskly against the decaying leaf litter, some that was so dried up and crunchy it sounded like a packet of chips being smashed beneath heavy soles. Snow White had her attentive, discerning nose pinned to the earthen floor, as she pilferaged the trail for any exciting scent markings that aroused her interest, and as usual she seemed riveted and fully absorbed. She looked at me through dark, soulful eyes, and woofed a couple of times, as if to say, "Wouldn't you like to know?" Then she ebulliently scooted ahead of me. The trail looked much as it had done any other day of the week, but being later on in the afternoon,
was even more transfixing, as the golden glaze of the sun beginning to set over the valley was breathtakingly beautiful, and the earthen floor was covered with a confetti of golden leaves that was mesmerizing at this time of the day, under the ethereal light of the late afternoon. I decided I could be no more than 15 minutes on this trail. I would need to head straight back. I resigned myself to the unfortunate fact that, as usual, my son-in-law was absolutely right, and if I didn't make tracks back to the car soon, when the light was waning, I could easily get caught up in the dark. I guess I had not bargained on a faithless son, being so hell-bent on letting me down, by retiring fast, reticently shrinking into the shadows, as if hiding her light under a bushel, and only intent on staining the sky for a few fleeting minutes, in a rich kaleidoscope of golds, tangerines, and oranges, then shrinking subserviently behind the clouds. It was as if in 1 minute the sunset was there, and the next minute those pretty colours were confiscated by a smouldering grey colour, as the dingy twilight was beginning to roll in, with an assiduous determination that could not be thwarted. I was feeling bitterly disappointed. I was so invigorated, refreshed, and thoroughly enjoying the fresh air blowing against my skin, and the feeling of stretching my stiff legs. But now I really needed to head back, because I did not want to be wrestling with the gloomy oppression of a dark night, and with only a tiny torch in my jacket pocket, fumbling around in the darkness and navigating my way through this woodgrove would not be an easy task. The wind stepped up its speed and whistled through the trees vigorously. Branches were swinging up and down rather precariously. The breeze whipped up gold autumn leaves like celestial butterflies that brushed past my skin. And that was when I heard a baby crying. My first thought was, oh my God, someone has dumped their baby in this woodgrove, and this poor little mite would never survive the night. It could be anywhere. I'd recently read a true story of a woman who abandoned her baby in the woods. The baby was looked after overnight by wolves. Then the pack leader of the wolves led a kind farmer to the baby, and he adopted her as his own little girl. It was ironic, as the previous summer this farmer had lost his 1-year-old baby to SIDS, which is known as sudden infant death syndrome, where a baby dies for no medical reason at all. When the farmer discovered this baby, his broken heart began to recover, as it represented a green shoot of recovery in his life. No one knew who the mother was, and she was never found, and why she abandoned her child, that remains a mystery. I became very concerned for the baby's cries in the woodgrove, that sounded much like my babies had done when they were little. I felt grievously angry with the mother, whoever she was, for being so negligent and selfish. I couldn't just turn around and go back home, or I'd be worrying about this baby. It was as if Snow White had read my mind, because she began to run through the woodgrove with me tagging behind her, as if she knew exactly where we would find this abandoned child. I had images of a teenager giving birth in a toilet cubicle, and coming out to the countryside to leave the baby for the wild animals to eat. You would think that that kind of preposterous thing would not happen these days. But stuff like this still goes on behind closed doors. But most of us don't know about it. And all over the world, abandoned babies are left in all kinds of precarious places, in the hope they might be found by a random stranger. But out here, there were no chances of that happening. Maybe with DNA profiles so good these days, the mother wanted her baby gone for good. You never know what goes on inside people's heads. I won't deny I was intimidated by the gloomy sky that hovered over my head and steeped through the trees, the colour of black tea. It was as if someone was gradually turning down the dimmer switch, so it was slowly growing darker and darker and darker. Snow White bounded towards a distinctive sculptural tree with branches that opened up like a mother's warm hug. And that was when I saw a bundle lying in the tree branch, in a woven basket covered in a deer pelt. I removed the basket from the tree, thinking that I was caught up in a similar situation as Moses in the bulrushes, when that Egyptian woman discovered little Moses lying in a basket, only this basket was contained in a tree and not floating above the water. The baby was howling, and I pulled it out of the deer pelt, and to my amazement discovered it was covered in hair,
but it had a very cute human face and bright brown eyes. Is this why the mother had abandoned her child, I wondered? She recognized that her son was not like normal babies and had a physical impediment. The baby was born with way too much hair. But there were things that could be done with problems like that these days. I had heard about this condition before. I didn't doubt for a moment that the baby was human. I rocked it tenderly in my arms. Snow White licked her little face, and the baby immediately stopped crying and began to gurgle happily. Truly it was one of the cutest babies I have ever seen, despite her physical impediment. I then picked her up in the basket and carried it down the trail, wondering what kind of reaction I'd get from my daughter and her husband when they saw the hairy little mite that I brought home with me. I was getting good at picking up abandoned strays. I was wondering if I might be able to persuade my daughter to adopt the poor little thing, as in my advancing years I would not be in a good position to take on such a responsibility. But we did have the financial means to afford the finest doctors for the little child, who could address the problem with hair. But this little mite deserved to have a promising future, and the mother abandoning her child like this was disgusting as far as I was concerned. As these thoughts rolled through my head, I suddenly heard heavy feet pounding the ground. It sounded as if a cantankerous rhino with an axe to grind was charging towards me. The ground wobbled, heaved, vibrated under its powerful thrusts. My first thought was, what the hell is that? The woodgrove suddenly became eerily quiet, as the crickets and frogs that had begun their cheerful chorus suddenly became cloyingly mute. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up on end, and I knew something was terribly wrong. My heart began to flutter violently in my chest like a terrified bird, and every single cell in my body was screaming, "Run, Chuck, run!" But my legs were weighed down by blocks of cement. As I tried to pick up speed, I felt as if I was clawing my way against an invisible wall of resistance, as if hands I could not see were anchoring me firmly to the ground. A feeling of impending dread overwhelmed me, and I could swear a voice echoed through me, screaming, "No! No! No!" Snow White began to growl, and the hair on her back doubled up in size, so she looked absolutely enormous. She was glancing behind her, with a look of fear on her face, as if she could pick up a foreboding energy on the wind that she did not like. Something was after us, and whatever it was big, it was predatory, it was dangerous. For a moment I saw my life flashing before me, as I anticipated that this was it for me, and in that moment the death I had so longed for, I denied, for I realized more than anything I wanted to live. I could sense the predator before I actually saw it, and I knew I was in grievous trouble, and this poor little baby in the basket didn't stand a fighting chance. I was doomed. We were doomed. The next thing I knew was a stone went flying in my direction, and I heard a loud, frantic scream. It was almost disembodied, hauntingly scary. The stone was huge, missing me by mere inches. I turned around to see this giant hairy woman that I knew at once was a Bigfoot. She stood up on 2 feet, covered in cinnamon-colour hair, with a white patch under her chin. She was robust, powerful, mighty, her body nimble, dense with muscle. She looked so intimidating, standing up at 9 foot tall and probably 800 pounds, and I don't doubt for a second she would have the strength to lift up a car. That's how powerful she was. But this hairy lady was not pleased with me. She was oscillating her arms at me furiously, waving them around in indignation, screaming at me in a strange language. "Kilakikwa! Kilakwika! Kilakwikwa! Homakilaki! Homakina!" She began to run towards me. I think she said, "What are you doing with my baby? What are you doing?" I couldn't react in time. I was so bemused, so startled by what I was observing. The next thing I knew, she'd grabbed me violently and thrown me off the ground. She hit me with a fist on the side of my head, and everything went black. If she'd intended to harm me,
She could have inflicted greater damage, but she just knocked me out. The way she reacted was very natural for an affronted mother. I'm really surprised she did not kill me, and thankful for that too. I'm not sure wearing her shoes I would have been quite so considerate in the circumstances, as it seemed as if I was abducting her baby. I am glad to say my son-in-law found me in the woodgrove with Snow White lying over my body to keep me warm. That's how faithful and loyal my dog was. I was concussed for a day or so, and when I remembered what had happened, I was angry with myself for not realizing that this creature was not a human baby, but it had looked so human in every way. I returned to the woodgrove to make amends. I left a huge basket of treats for the female Bigfoot. I have continued to take that hiking trail, and on one occasion I saw a female Bigfoot, who looked up at me and nodded, and then glided away. So I do think I've made my peace with her. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. My word, can you imagine finding a baby Bigfoot in the woodgrove and you actually think it's human, and you find out that it's actually not, and you're greeted to a very angry female Bigfoot. Personally, I'm surprised she didn't kill him, because I think even a human mother might do the very same when you think someone's abducting your baby.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.